Infinity activates an ancient device. Everyone regrets it. The signal had been wrong for 6 weeks. Not wrong in the way that signals were wrong when they were corrupted or attenuated or produced by equipment operating outside its rated parameters. Wrong in the way that something was wrong when it was exactly what the instruments said it was, and the instruments were saying something that shouldn't exist, Doctor. Yuna Anders had been running the Artifact Research Division's long-range monitoring array for 3 years, and she had developed, through that time, a reliable taxonomy of anomalous readings. Instrument error, environmental interference, uncharted natural phenomenon, and genuine discovery. The taxonomy was hierarchical. You ruled out the first 3 before you committed to the 4th, because the 4th had consequences, and consequences required certainty. She had ruled out the first 3 at the end of week 2. The signal was Forerunner. In its base architecture, she recognized the carrier frequency, the encoding structure, the specific mathematical signature that Forerunner communication systems used, regardless of their function or era of construction. She had spent 3 years cataloging that signature in every form it appeared in the recovered artifacts that Infinity's research division had been studying. And she knew it the way a musicologist knew a composer's style, not just the notes, but the grammar beneath the notes, the deep structural choices that persisted across everything. But the signal had something else in it. Layered beneath the Forerunner architecture, woven into it the way a harmony was woven into a melody, a second signature that was not Forerunner, and not any cataloged technology in the UNSC's database, and not, as far as she had been able to determine in 6 weeks of increasingly focused analysis, anything that human science had a framework for. She had brought it to Captain Lasky at the end of week 4. Lasky had read her report with the focused attention he brought to everything thoroughly, without the impatience that junior officers sometimes brought to scientific briefings, the specific quality of a commander who understood that the things he didn't fully understand were the things most likely to matter. He had asked 3 questions. The 3rd question had been, "Where is it coming from?" She had given him the coordinates. He had looked at them on the navigation display for a moment. Then he had looked at her. "It's not near anything," he said. "No," she said. "It's in deep space, between systems, nothing in the astronomical catalog within 12 light years. And you want to investigate." "I want to understand what I'm looking at," she said, "which requires being closer to it than we currently are." Lasky had approved the course correction 2 days later. After routing it through the Spartan commander's tactical assessment, Palmer had reviewed the data, noted that the signal's location was outside any known threat zone, recommended a full combat readiness posture on approach as standard procedure, and signed off. Standard procedure for Infinity was what most warships considered exceptional readiness, so the recommendation cost nothing and covered the contingency. The approach had taken 11 days at Infinity's slip space speed. The signal was resolved at 0600 ship time on the 73rd day of what the crew manifest listed as a standard patrol and resupply transit. Anders was in the research bay when the navigation system registered the slip space exit. She felt it in the ship's hull, the specific resonance of emergence, and looked up from her workstation and noted the time. Then she looked at her monitoring array output and saw that the signal, which had been a distant reading for 6 weeks and a near reading for the last 11 days, was now. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she opened the comm to the bridge. "Captain," she said, "the signal. It's not coming from a point source. It's coming from a structure." Lasky's voice. "How large?" She ran the preliminary structural analysis in the 10 seconds it took him to ask the question and receive the data on the bridge display. "Large," she said. On the bridge, the main display showed what Infinity's sensors were resolving as the slip space exit completed, and the external picture clarified from the motion blur of emergence to the specific detail of real space at rest. It was not a natural object. This was clear before the structural analysis completed, before the material composition scan returned its results, before any of the ship's systems had processed the visual data into anything more specific than geometric shapes in deep space. It was clear because natural objects did not have right angles. They did not have the specific regularity of components arranged according to an engineering logic. They did not have, as this object did, a surface texture that caught the light of the distant star system in the specific way of worked metal, the difference between a rock face and a machined surface, visible to the human eye before any instrument confirmed it. The structure was large, not infinity large, larger than infinity, significantly larger, by a ratio that the ranging system was still computing when Lieutenant Commander Jameson, the bridge officer on watch, said quietly, "Sir, the Artifact Research Division is going to want to know about this." "They already know," Lasky said. He was standing at the command platform looking at the display with the expression he wore when situations were revealing themselves faster than briefings could keep pace with. "Get Commander Palmer up here and tell Dr. Anders." The structure lit up. Not gradually, not the slow warm-up of a system coming online from cold, not the sequential activation of components in an orderly startup sequence. All at once, the entire surface, every component simultaneously, as though every system had been sitting in a state of suspended readiness for exactly this signal and had been waiting for nothing except the presence of the thing that had just arrived. The light was not the amber of standby systems or the blue-white of operational power. It was something between those colors that the human eye had no precise name for, a frequency that registered in the visual cortex as significant before the conscious mind had articulated why. Every Forerunner artifact in Infinity's research bay activated simultaneously. Every one of them. The catalogued pieces, the fragments, the partially understood components that had been sitting in containment for months without response to any stimulus, all of them, at the same moment, in the same frequency as the structure's light. Anders heard it through the research bay's structural sensors before she heard it through the comm, a resonance in the hull that was not vibration exactly, but the specific harmonic of two compatible systems recognizing each other. The physical expression of an architectural handshake between Infinity's Forerunner-integrated superstructure and whatever the structure outside had just sent. She had 2 seconds to understand what was happening. The understanding arrived cleanly and completely the 6 weeks of analysis. The hybrid signal, the second signature beneath the Forerunner carrier, the specific combination of architectures that she had been trying to parse from a distance and was now experiencing as an event rather than a reading. The structure was not Forerunner. It was something the Forerunner architecture had been designed to be compatible with. Something older, something that had been sitting in the dark between star systems waiting for a compatible signal, and Infinity's Forerunner-integrated hull had provided that signal simply by arriving, simply by being the thing it was, simply by existing in proximity. She opened the comm. "Captain," she said, "we didn't find the signal source." She paused, and in the pause, the research bay's Forerunner artifacts continued their simultaneous resonance, every piece responding to the structure outside in the specific way of things designed to respond, doing what they had always been built to do at the moment they finally encountered the trigger. "The signal source found us, and I think we just—" She stopped. Through the research bay's external viewport, she could see what the structure was doing now that it had completed its startup sequence. It was opening. Not a door, nothing as simple as a door. A section of the structure's surface was reconfiguring, the components separating and rearranging in the specific geometry of a system designed for a specific function, activating that function for the first time in a very long time. The reconfiguration produced a shape that Anders had spent 3 years studying in miniature, in fragment, in the partial records of ancient technology that the SGC had shared with the UNSC's Artifact Research Program under the Joint Scientific Exchange Agreement that nobody in the public had been told about. She knew what the shape was. She had seen it from the inside many times. She had never seen one this large. "Captain," she said. Her voice was very steady, which was the result of 3 years of practice at delivering findings that required steadiness. "It's a gate. The structure is a stargate. The largest one I have ever seen." She paused, "and it is currently dialing." On the bridge, Lasky looked at the display. The gate was dialing. 12 symbols, not 7, a longer address than the standard Stargate sequences the SGC had shared in the joint program documentation. An address that the dialing sequence was entering with the smooth automation of a system that had been programmed to dial this address the moment it activated and had been waiting 10,000 years to execute the instruction. The wormhole was established. The event horizon bloomed in the specific blue-white of an active Stargate, the color that Anders had seen in briefing documents and holographic reconstructions, and had never expected to see at this scale, filling a gate aperture large enough to pass a ship the size of Infinity through, with clearance to spare. Something came through. Not a ship, not a physical object, a signal the same hybrid architecture she had been analyzing for 6 weeks, Forerunner-compatible and ancient structured, and neither of those things exactly. Transmitted through the active wormhole and received by every Forerunner artifact in Infinity's research bay, and by the ship's Forerunner-integrated hull systems simultaneously. The translation took 11 seconds. Not because the decryption was complex, the signal was not encrypted. Because the language it was written in was ancient, and the ship's translation system was running the ancient language database that the SGC had provided, and finding the message in it with the precision of something that had been composed in full knowledge of what translation system would be used to read it. 4 words appeared on the research bay's display, 4 words on the bridge display, 4 words on every screen aboard the UNSC Infinity that the ship's communication system fed, which was most of them. "We have been patient." Anders looked at the 4 words. She thought about 6 weeks of a signal she hadn't been able to fully parse. She thought about the hybrid architecture, Forerunner-compatible, ancient structured, belonging to neither, and predating both. She thought about the specific weight of the patient as a word choice, not waiting, not ready, not any of the words that biological urgency would have produced. Patient. The word of something that had experienced 10,000 years not as a duration but as a quality of existence. The word of something for whom the passage of time was not loss but simply time, unremarkable and indefinite, and not a cost. She thought about what kind of intelligence chose that word. Then she hit the comm to the bridge. The Daedalus arrived 4 hours and 17 minutes after the hub activated. Not because 4 hours was the fastest the ship could travel from its last known position to the hub's coordinates. The Daedalus could cover the distance in 3 hours at emergency slipspace speed, and Colonel Stephen Caldwell had ordered emergency slipspace speed the moment the SGC's monitoring network had gone from routine background readings to every alarm in Cheyenne Mountain activating simultaneously. The extra hour and 17 minutes was the time it had taken General Landry to reach Caldwell by secure.com, brief him on the monitoring network's readings, authorize the mission parameters, clear the emergency transit with the IOA's duty officer, and allow Caldwell to do the specific things that Caldwell did before taking the Daedalus into a situation he didn't have a complete picture of, which were, in order, review every available piece of intelligence, identify the variables he couldn't control, brief his senior staff, and eat something, because Caldwell had learned in 30 years of command that decisions made hungry were decisions made slightly worse than necessary. He ate in 4 minutes. He arrived with the Daedalus's weapon systems at full readiness and its shields at combat configuration, and Dr. Daniel Jackson in the forward observation lounge, because Jackson had been aboard for a linguistic consultation on recovered tablet fragments when the alert came in, and Landry had specifically said to keep him there, which Caldwell had interpreted as an instruction to make use of the most experienced ancient language expert available, rather than park him in a room and ignore him. Jackson was already at the observation lounge's forward viewport when the Daedalus dropped out of slipspace. He looked at Infinity, first the 3-kilometer warship hanging in space with the specific quality of something that had arrived and not left, its hull active with what the Daedalus's sensors resolved as Forerunner-derived power fluctuations. The research base section of the ship lit differently than the rest, in the specific frequency that the SGC's Joint Program documentation associated with active Forerunner artifact resonance. Then he looked at the hub. Then he looked at the active gate. Then he looked at the event horizon and what was moving through it. He pressed the comm to the bridge. "Caldwell," he said. "I see it, Jackson," Caldwell said. "The gate address," Jackson said. "Is it in the dialing computer's buffer?" "The dialing computer has 47 new addresses in its buffer that weren't there 6 hours ago," Caldwell said. "The hub activated them when it came online. This is one of them. Whatever's coming through has been coming through since before we arrived." Jackson looked at the event horizon. What was coming through was not physical, not matter, not energy in any form the Daedalus' sensors had a clean category for. It was information, transmitted through the active wormhole in the hybrid architecture, that the monitoring network had been reading as anomalous, and that Jackson was now seeing it at close range with the translation systems active, beginning to parse as something he had a partial framework for. Partial, not complete. He had a partial framework because the SGC's deepest classified records, the files that required General Landry's specific authorization to access, and that Jackson had accessed 4 times in 12 years, each time finding something in them that required several days of quiet sitting to fully process, contained a reference to a pre-ancient intelligence in the Milky Way that the Lanteans had documented at the highest security. Classification available to them, and had classified in a language that was not standard ancient, but a dialect so old that the standard translation matrix produced approximations rather than meanings. He had translated 3 pages of the reference document on the second access. He had translated 6 more on the third. He had spent 2 weeks on the remaining 40 pages on the fourth, and had produced a working translation that he was 68% confident in and that had been sitting in a classified folder on his workstation for 8 months. Because he hadn't known what to do with the implications and had been waiting, in the specific way that archaeologists waited for context, for something that made the implications legible. The hub's activation was the context. He pressed the comm again. "I need to talk to whoever is in command of that warship," he said, immediately. Lasky took the hail in the bridge's secure comm alcove, the specific configuration of Infinity's communication systems that allowed a conversation to happen without the entire bridge crew as an audience, which was a feature that had been used more in the last 4 hours than in the previous 3 years combined. The man on the comm screen was not in military uniform. He had the specific appearance of someone whose relationship with institutional clothing was theoretical rather than practiced civilian consultant, Lasky assessed. The kind that major military operations accumulated in proportion to how much they encountered things that defied standard tactical responses. He also had the specific appearance, visible in the quality of his attention and the organization of his first sentence, of someone who was very good at what he did. "Captain Lasky," the man said. "My name is Dr. Daniel Jackson. I work with the SGC, that's the Stargate Command, which is the organization responsible for the gate network that your ship has accidentally reconnected to a section of that has been sealed for 10,000 years. He paused. "I need you to not be alarmed by what I'm about to tell you, and I want to acknowledge up front that what I'm about to tell you is inherently alarming." Lasky looked at him for a moment. "Go ahead," Lasky said. "The structure your ship activated is called a network hub," Jackson said. "The ancients, the civilization that built the Stargate network, sealed it approximately 10,000 years ago when they left the Milky Way. The sealing was deliberate, carefully engineered, and based on the ancients' assessment that what was on the other side of the gate, addresses the hub connected to needed to stay on the other side." He paused. "The signal your ship responded to, the one that triggered the hub's activation, it was designed to be activated by Forerunner technology. The ancients anticipated that Forerunner-compatible architecture would eventually enter proximity range, and they designed the hub's activation trigger accordingly. They were not wrong about the timeline. Lasky processed this. They designed the hub to be activated by technology they knew would exist eventually," he said. "Why? That's the part I'm still working on," Jackson said. "The records are incomplete, and the dialect is difficult. But the partial translation I have suggests that the sealing was not intended to be permanent." He paused. "The ancients sealed the hub rather than destroying it. They left the activation mechanism intact. They designed the activation to require a specific technological threshold Forerunner-compatible architecture that they knew would take a long time to develop." His expression had the quality of someone organizing implications that resisted clean organization. "I think they intended for the hub to be reopened when the right conditions existed. And they decided we were the right conditions," Lasky said. "Your ship's Forerunner hull integration decided that," Jackson said. "Whether the ancients would agree with the assessment is something I'll have a better answer to in approximately 18 hours. Lasky looked at the active gate on the main display, the event horizon still open. The information transmission through it, continuing in the hybrid architecture that Infinity's systems were receiving and not yet fully parsing. "The message," Lasky said. "We have been patient. What sent it?" Jackson's expression indicated he had been waiting for this question and had prepared for it by deciding to answer it completely rather than incrementally. "The Vadranu," he said. "It's an ancient word. A name, designation, classification. The records use all three interchangeably. It translates approximately as the ones who were here before the gates. They predate the Stargate network. They predate the ancients' arrival in the Milky Way." He paused. "They were here first, and the ancients built the gate network through what was effectively their territory, and the conflict over the infrastructure lasted millennia. And the ancients resolved it by sealing the Vadranu out of the gate network and leaving them in the section of the galaxy that the sealed addresses connected to." Another pause. 10,000 years ago. The bridge was quiet. Lieutenant Commander Jameson, who had been maintaining the respectful professional distance from the secure, calm alcove that the situation required, was maintaining it less successfully than he had been 30 seconds ago. "They've been locked out of the gate network for 10,000 years, Lasky said. "Yes," Jackson said, "and we just unlocked it." "Your ship's Forerunner hull integration unlocked it," Jackson said, with the specific precision of someone declining to assign blame while remaining accurate. "The distinction is not particularly comforting," Lasky said. "No," Jackson said, "it isn't." Palmer had the briefing before Lasky finished the call, not the full briefing, the operational summary, the version that Palmer needed to have staged responses to the variables that were already active. She received it from Jameson in 40 seconds on the bridge and spent the next 90 seconds issuing deployment orders to Fireteam Majestic, Fireteam Phoenix, and the 3 reserve teams she had been staging since the hub activated, because Palmer's operational philosophy was that the time to position assets was before you needed them, and the time to need them was never quite when you expected. She arrived at the secure comm alcove as Lasky ended the call. "Jackson?" Lasky said to Palmer. "SGC linguist, ancient language specialist. He has a partial translation of the relevant classified records that he describes as 68% confident." 68, Palmer said. "His number, not mine," Lasky said. "What's coming through the gate? Information transmissions?" Palmer said. "No physical objects or life signs through the event horizon. The transmissions are being received by every Forerunner artifact in the research bay and by the hull's integrated systems. Anders has the artifact resonance under monitoring, but not under control. Whatever the Vadranu are transmitting, the artifacts are responding to it the way they respond to everything by doing what they were built to do, and what they were built to do is receiving and processing Forerunner-compatible signals. The artifacts are receiving Vadranu transmissions," Lasky said. "The artifacts don't know the difference between a Forerunner transmission and a Vadranu transmission," Palmer said. "The architectural compatibility that activated the hub is the same compatibility that the artifacts are responding to. From the artifact's perspective, it's all the same signal." Lasky thought about this. "The hull," he said. "If the artifacts are receiving the transmissions, is the hull receiving them too?" "Yes," Palmer said. "Anders is on it. She's monitoring the hull integration for any sign of system response beyond passive reception." She paused. "So far, it's passive." The transmissions are coming in, and the systems are registering them, but nothing is executing. Yet, Lasky said. Yet? Palmer confirmed. He looked at the active gate on the main display. Get Anders up here, he said. And raise the Daedalus again. I want Jackson on the Infinity. He looked at Palmer. And I want your Spartans positioned at every Forerunner system interface point on the ship. Palmer's expression indicated this order had been given approximately 90 seconds before he'd given it. Already done? She said. Jackson came aboard via the Daedalus's puddle jumper, the small ancient shuttle that the ship carried for exactly the situations where a Stargate was unavailable and a small fast transport was required. He arrived in Infinity's secondary hangar bay and stood in the middle of it for a moment, looking at the scale of the ship from the inside, which was different from the scale of the ship from the outside in the specific way that everything was different from the inside than the outside. He had been inside large ships before. The Daedalus felt large, the Odyssey felt large. The Hatak vessels that the SGC had captured and crewed and occasionally lost felt large in the specific oppressive way of architecture designed by people who had not prioritized human comfort. Infinity felt like a city that had decided to be a ship. A Marine escort met him at the hangar bay and took him to the research bay because Lasky had correctly assessed that the first conversation that needed to happen was between Jackson and Anders rather than between Jackson and the Kala. Bridge, which was where the command decisions would eventually need to be made but was not where the understanding that would enable those decisions could be built. Anders met him at the research bay entrance. She was shorter than he'd expected. The voice on the comm had carried a quality of presence that his mental image of the source had made taller, and she had the specific, focused expression of a scientist who had been awake. For 22 hours working on a problem that kept getting more significant instead of less. She looked at him with the rapid assessment of someone who had been told that an ancient language expert was coming and was now checking the claim against the reality. You've read the records, she said. Not a greeting, a confirmation. Partially, Jackson said. The dialect is old, she said. Very, he said. Older than anything in the standard matrix. I've been working on it for 8 months. She looked at him for a moment. Come in, she said. I need to show you something. The research bay was the largest space Jackson had been in since the Destiny briefing rooms, and it was full of the specific productive chaos of a scientific operation that had been running at emergency capacity for 4 hours. Forerunner artifacts on every surface, monitoring equipment connected to all of them. The displays showing the real-time resonance data from the hull integration, Anders's analysis workstation at the center of it all with approximately 14 windows open and active. She took him to the main display and pulled up the transmission data, the hybrid signal that had been coming through the active gate since before the Daedalus arrived, the Forerunner-compatible Vadranu architecture that the artifacts were receiving and responding to. Jackson looked at it. He had seen the signal's base architecture in the classified records, not the signal itself, but the description of the architecture, the ancient researchers' documentation of how the Vadranu communicated, written in the difficult old dialect that his translation was 68% confident in. Seeing the actual architecture rather than the description of it was the difference between reading about a piece of music and hearing it. The description was accurate, but the thing itself had qualities the description couldn't. Carrie, they're not just transmitting, he said. No, Anders said. The transmissions have a response component. The artifacts aren't just receiving, they're in a two-way exchange. Something in their Forerunner programming is answering the Vadranu transmissions automatically, without human instruction. Because the Vadranu signal is compatible enough with their operational architecture that it triggers the automatic response protocols. She paused. The artifacts have been talking to the Vadranu for 4 hours. Jackson looked at the artifact response data. What have they been saying? He said. I don't know, Anders said. The response data is in the Forerunner operational language, the deep technical dialect that the Artifact Research Division has been working on for 3 years and has approximately 40% coverage of. She looked at him. You know the ancient side of this. I know the Forerunner side. Between us, "We might have enough," Jackson said. He sat down at her workstation without being asked, which was something he did when the work was urgent and the work was clearly where he needed to be, and pulled up the transmission data alongside his 8 months of Vadranu translation work and Anders's Forerunner operational language database, and the two of them sat in the middle of the research bay chaos and began building the bridge between what they each knew. Outside, through the research bay's external viewport, the hub's massive gate was still active, and through the other 46 reconnected addresses, the ones that had come online when the hub activated, the ones that connected to the section of the Milky Way where the Vadranu had spent 10,000 years in the dark building whatever they had been building, things were beginning to move, not quickly, not with the urgency of an attack force or the momentum of an army, with the specific, deliberate pace of something that had 10,000 years of patience in its operational architecture and considered the current moment not an emergency, but an appointment. An appointment that was, from the Vadranu's perspective, 10,000 years overdue. Daniel Jackson had translated things that changed the world. Not metaphorically, literally, in the specific sense that the information contained in certain texts, once rendered from one language into another, had altered the course of events in ways that were measurable and permanent, and that he had sometimes been able to anticipate, and sometimes had not. The Goa'uld tablet that had given SG-1 the coordinates for the first Alpha site, the Ori manuscript that had revealed the prior plague's mechanism, the Lantean records that had unlocked the Atlantis expedition's first year of gate addresses. Each translation had been a door, and doors opened onto things you couldn't see from outside them. And the things behind them were not always what you'd hoped, and were occasionally what you'd feared, and were sometimes something that had no prior category and required the category to be built from the evidence. He had learned to pace himself. He was not pacing himself now. The Vadranu transmission data and the Forerunner artifact response logs and his 8 months of dialect translation work and Anders's 3 years of operational language coverage were spread across 4 workstation displays. Simultaneously, and he was moving between them in the specific focused way that happened when the work was urgent enough that his normal editorial process, check, cross-reference, qualify, check again, compressed into something faster and less careful and more likely to miss the thing that needed catching. He knew he was doing it. He kept doing it anyway, because the alternative was slower and slower, meant the hub stayed active, and the hub staying active meant 47 reconnected addresses, and the Vadranu were moving through them with the deliberate pace of something that had been waiting 10,000 years and considered the current pace entirely appropriate. The classification system, Anders said. She was on the display to his left, the Forerunner artifact response logs broken into segments she was working through methodically. The way the Vadranu architecture organizes information, it's not hierarchical, not linear, it's network-based, Jackson said. Everything referenced to everything else simultaneously. The ancients documented it as, he checked his translation, the thought of all at once, which is my rendering of a concept that doesn't have a direct, ancient equivalent, and probably doesn't have a human one either. The Forerunner architecture processes the same way, Anders said. The artifacts aren't just compatible with the Vadranu transmissions because of similar encoding. They're compatible because they think in the same structure. Network-based, simultaneous reference. She pulled up a comparison display. Look at this. He looked at it. The comparison showed the Vadranu transmission architecture alongside the Forerunner artifact response architecture, overlaid, and the overlay was not approximate, it was nearly exact. The two systems' fundamental organizational logic so close that the differences were variations rather than distinctions, the same grammar expressed in different vocabularies. The Forerunners and the Vadranu, Jackson said slowly. We're in contact, Anders said. At some point, long enough that the Forerunners adopted the Vadranu's organizational architecture for their own systems. She paused. Or the Vadranu adopted the Forerunners, or they developed it independently and the similarity is convergent. But the similarity is not coincidental. Jackson looked at the overlay for a long moment. He thought about the 17 contact events in the ancient database, the ones Cortana had found in Pegasus, which the SGC had received a summary of in the joint intelligence exchange with the Atlantis expedition 3 months ago. Forerunners and Ancients. 2 civilizations in the same galaxy, the same period, apparently aware of each other and mostly failing to communicate productively about it. The Vadranu were a third element. Not in the same period older, the records said. Here before the Ancients arrived, here before the Forerunners developed to their peak. Here, in the specific deep time sense of something that predated the civilizations that had subsequently defined the galaxy's history. And the Forerunners had adopted their architecture, which meant the Forerunners and the Vadranu had been in contact long enough and productively enough for a fundamental organizational borrowing to occur, which meant the galaxy's actual history of intelligence was more layered than the SGC's working model had accounted for. He filed this and kept working. At the 2-hour mark of their collaboration, Jackson found the section of the classified records he had been looking for since he sat down. It was in the 40 pages he had translated on the 4th access, the section his 68% confidence rating was doing the most work to cover, the section where the old dialect's vocabulary shifted into terminology that had no standard ancient equivalents and required inference and contextual reasoning rather than direct translation. He had flagged 47 passages in those pages as requiring additional context before he could commit to a rendering. 43 of the 47 flags were still active. The passage he found was one of the 4 he had resolved. He had resolved it because it was the passage that had driven him to spend 2 weeks on the translation in the first place. The passage where the Lantian researcher who had written the original document had abandoned the formal, scholarly register of the rest of the text and written in something that felt, even through the distance of translation and time, like the direct expression of personal experience rather than academic documentation. He read it again now. In the context of Anders's Forerunner comparison and the active transmission data and the 47 reconnected gate addresses and the Vadranu moving through them with their 10,000-year patience, the passage read, "We did not seal them because they were malicious. Malice we understood. We had fought malicious things, and we knew the shape of that fight, and we knew, in time, how to end it. The Vadranu were not malicious. They were vast, and they were old, and they were entirely indifferent to us in the specific way that the ocean is indifferent to the fish in it, not hostile, not caring, simply present in a way that made our presence incidental. We built the gate network through their domain, and they noticed the way a mountain notices a road built across it not at all, until the traffic became sufficient volume that the noticing became unavoidable. And then they responded not with anger, but with the interest of something that had previously had no reason to look closely, and now did. And what concerned us was not the response. What concerned us was what we saw when they looked at us clearly for the first time. They did not see a civilization. They saw a network. They saw the gates and the connections between the gates and the flow of matter and energy and information through those connections. And they understood, immediately, completely, and with a clarity that took us decades to develop, what the network was for and what it could become. And they wanted it, not to destroy it, not to control it in any sense we had a word for. They wanted to be part of it in the way that a river wants to be part of the ocean, not want, exactly, not in the biological sense, but the directional inevitability of systems that are compatible finding their way to each other. We sealed them out because we were not ready for what being part of them would mean. We left the door because we thought that someday someone might be. Jackson sat with this for a long time. Anders had stopped working. She was looking at the passage on the display beside her, which he had shared to her screen when he found it, and she had the expression of someone reading something that was reorganizing her working model of the situation from the foundation up. "They don't want to attack us," she said. "No," Jackson said. "They want to connect," she said. "To the gate network, to us." She paused. "To the Forerunner architecture in Infinity's hull." The ancients said they were like a river finding an ocean, Jackson said. The river doesn't destroy the ocean. It joins it. The joining changes both. He paused. The ancients weren't ready for what the joining would change. They sealed the door. And we opened it, Anders said. We opened it, Jackson said. The silence between them lasted exactly as long as it took both of them to follow the implication to its conclusion. The artifacts? Anders said. The 4-hour exchange between the artifacts and the Vadranu transmissions. If the Vadranu's first instinct when the hub activated was to transmit, and if the artifacts responded automatically because of the architectural compatibility, then the exchange hasn't been hostile. It's been introduction, Jackson said. Or something analogous, she said. Something that functions like an introduction in a network-based simultaneous reference system. She pulled up the artifact response logs again, looking at them with the reorganized framework rather than the prior one. What have they been saying to each other for 4 hours? Jackson looked at the logs. He looked at his translation work. He looked at the Forerunner operational language coverage Anders had built. I think, he said slowly, we have enough to find out. It took another 3 hours. Not because the decoding was slow with Anders's Forerunner coverage and his Vadranu translation work, and the two of them in the specific productive collaboration of people who had found the shared vocabulary for a problem, were using it as fast as they could, but because the exchange was long, 4 hours of a two-way transmission between Forerunner artifacts and a Vadranu intelligence was a large volume of content. And the content was dense in the way that network-based, simultaneous reference communication was dense. Everything referenced to everything else. The meaning of each element, dependent on its relationship to every other element, which meant reading it linearly was the wrong approach, and building the relational map before reading any of it was the right approach. Anders built the map. Jackson populated it with meaning. At the 3-hour mark, they had a reading that Jackson rated at 74% confidence, which was the highest confidence rating he had given anything in the old dialect, and which he told Anders meant they should treat it as directionally accurate rather than definitively precise. The artifact exchange had not been introduced. It had been inventory. The Vadranu, through the 4-hour transmission exchange with Infinity's Forerunner artifacts, had conducted a systematic assessment of what Infinity carried, not the weapons systems, or the crew, or the tactical capability, but the artifacts themselves. Every piece in the research bay, every Forerunner component integrated into the hull, every fragment, every partial object, every item whose function the research division had cataloged or failed to catalog. The Vadranu had gone through all of it with the thoroughness of a network intelligence assessing what had arrived at its newly reconnected access point. And at the end of the inventory, in the final 40 minutes of the exchange, the section that had the highest information density and that had taken the longest to map the Vadranu had done something that neither of them had expected. They had provided what Jackson's translation rendered with 74% confidence as a correction. Not a correction to the inventory, a correction to the artifacts themselves. Specifically, 43 of the items in Infinity's research bay that the division had cataloged as damaged, partially functional, or of unknown purpose were, according to the Vadranu's transmission, none of those things. They were complete. They were functional. The division's assessment of their purpose was wrong in ways that the Vadranu had documented in detail, and the documentation included operating instructions for all 43 in the network-based simultaneous reference format that the Forerunner architecture processed natively, which the artifacts had received and which were now, if Jackson's reading was correct, stored in the artifact operational memory waiting to be executed. Jackson looked at the display for a long moment. He looked at Anders. She looked at him. 43 artifacts, she said, whose actual function we don't know. With operating instructions from a 10,000-year-old intelligence that predates the civilization that built them and apparently understands them better than we do. She paused. Currently sitting in the research bay. Yes, Jackson said. That we just told them how to activate. That we received instructions on how to activate, Jackson said carefully. Whether anyone activates them is a decision that needs to go to Lasky and Caldwell and General Landry." He paused. "And I would like to make that recommendation before Palmer's Spartans find the operating instructions in the artifact memory and activate one by accident." Anders was already on the comm to the bridge. "Captain Lasky," she said, "Dr. Jackson and I need to brief you immediately. We've completed the preliminary translation of the Vadranu artifact exchange." She paused. "And I need to tell you that the situation is significantly more complex than the forward message suggested, and that some of the complexity is potentially—" She looked at Jackson. "Interesting," Jackson said. "Tell him it's potentially interesting." "Interesting," Anders said into the comm, "and that we need to brief you before anything else happens in the research bay." Lasky's voice came back with the specific quality of a commander who had been managing a complex situation for 6 hours and had developed a reliable relationship with the category of significantly more complex. "On my way," he said. Outside the research bay's viewport, the hub's gate was still active. The transmission through it had not stopped, and at the 47 reconnected addresses across the sealed section of the Milky Way, the Vadranu continued their deliberate movement through their own reconnected infrastructure with the patience of something that had been waiting 10,000 years and found the current pace of events, if anything, slightly faster than expected. They had been waiting for this. They had known, in the specific way that network intelligences knew things completely, simultaneously, without the sequential processing that biological minds use to arrive at conclusions that the door would open eventually. They had prepared accordingly. For 10,000 years they had prepared, and the preparation was thorough. The briefing happened in the research bay, rather than the bridge. Lasky made this call in the corridor outside. It looked at the distance between where he was and the bridge, looked at the distance between where he was and the research bay door, thought about the 43 artifacts with operating instructions stored in their memory and the active hub gate visible through the research bay viewport and Palmer's Spartans positioned at every Forerunner system interface, point on the ship, and decided that the briefing needed to happen where the evidence was, rather than where the command authority was. Command authority could move. Evidence was where it was. He brought Palmer because Palmer was always in the room when the situation had a physical component that required physical responses, and the 43 artifacts with new operating instructions were a physical component. He brought Caldwell because the SGC's institutional knowledge of the gate network was going to be necessary for every decision that came out of this briefing, and Caldwell was the SGC's senior officer present. He left the bridge to Jameson because Jameson was competent and because somebody needed to be watching the hub and the 47 reconnected addresses, and Jameson would do that without being told. Caldwell arrived from the Daedalus via the internal transit corridor that had been established between the two ships, a physical connection that Palmer had authorized 90 minutes into the situation because the comm architecture was sufficient for normal coordination and insufficient for the kind of coordination they were going to need, and Palmer's operational philosophy extended to communications infrastructure as readily as it extended to Spartan. Positioning. They assembled around Anders's central workstation, Lasky and Palmer on one side, Caldwell and Jackson on the other, Anders at the console, and the 4-display spread of translation work and artifact exchange logs and Vadranu transmission data arranged in the specific organized chaos of evidence presented for a briefing that needed to produce decisions rather than further questions. Jackson briefed. He gave it in the order he had given briefings for 20 years, context first, then findings, then implications, then the place where the implications ran out and uncertainty began, then the recommendations that uncertainty made possible rather than the certainties that weren't available. He had learned early in his career that military commanders needed the uncertainty mapped as clearly as the certainty because decisions made in the gap between them were the decisions that mattered most, and making them well required, knowing exactly where the gap was. The Vadranu, the pre-ancient history, the gate network conflict, the ceiling, 10,000 years. The hub's activation mechanism is designed for Forerunner-compatible architecture. The Lantian researchers' passage about the river and the ocean, the artifact exchange and the inventory and the correction and the 43 operating instructions now reside in the artifact memory. He finished and waited. Lasky was looking at the artifact exchange logs on the display. He had the expression of a commander whose operational picture had just been revised in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and who was organizing the revision into a form that produced decisions rather than paralysis. The Vedranu corrected our artifact assessment, he said, and provided operating instructions. Yes, Jackson said, for 43 artifacts that we currently believe are damaged or non-functional or of unknown purpose. Yes. And their motivation for doing this, Lasky said, based on your translation, is introduction, Jackson said, or the network intelligence equivalent of introduction. They've been isolated from the gate network for 10,000 years. The first thing they did when the hub activated was assess what had arrived at their reconnected access point. The second thing they did was demonstrate that they understand what arrived better than what arrived understands itself. He paused. It's an overture, a demonstration of knowledge as the basis for connection. They're saying, here is what we know that you don't. Here is the value of the relationship we're proposing. By giving us operating instructions for 43 potentially significant artifacts, Palmer said. Her voice had the specific flat quality it had when she was managing a strong tactical instinct that was not yet the right instinct for the situation. Without knowing what those artifacts do. We know some of what they do, Anders said. She pulled up her assessment revision 3 hours of work during the translation period, running Vedranu's corrections against the division's existing catalog. 14 of the 43 are power systems, specifically power conversion systems that the division assessed as decorative based on their form factor. The Vedranu's instructions indicate they're active conversion systems for a form of energy that the division's sensors weren't calibrated to detect. She paused. 12 are communication systems. The remaining 17 are, she looked at Jackson. The translation is less certain on the remaining 17, Jackson said. The functional descriptions use terminology that doesn't have clean equivalents in either my Vedranu work or Anders's Forerunner coverage. The best rendering I can give you is interface systems. Systems designed to facilitate connection between incompatible architectures. Between incompatible architectures, Caldwell said. Between the Vedranu's network architecture and other intelligence systems, Jackson said. Between the Vedranu and things that are not the Vedranu. He paused. The Forerunners built interface systems into artifacts they apparently intended to be used in Vedranu proximate environments, which suggests the relationship between the Forerunners and the Vedranu was more developed than the 17 contact events between the Ancients and the Forerunners suggest, because the Forerunners were building hardware for the relationship, not just documenting it. The research bay was quiet for a moment. Hardware for the relationship, Lasky said. The Forerunners built tools for talking to the Vedranu, Anders said. And those tools are in our research bay. And the Vedranu just told us how to use them. Palmer left the briefing at the 40-minute mark not because the briefing wasn't useful, but because the briefing had produced enough operational clarity for her to do what she needed to do, and remaining for the rest of it would have been presence for its own sake, which was not how Palmer operated. She went to the research bay's artifact storage section, which occupied the rear third of the space, and which her Spartans had been monitoring since she'd positioned them. Fireteam Majestic was on rotation with Fireteam Phoenix, 4 Spartans per shift, watching 43 artifacts that were now, as of the Vedranu transmission, no longer the inactive or damaged components the division had cataloged, but something that required reassessment. Spartan Thorn met her at the storage section entrance. Status, she said. Stable, he said. Passive resonance on all 43, matching the active artifacts in the main bay. No behavioral change visible. The operating instructions are in the artifact memory according to Dr. Anders's monitoring. We can see the data in the system, but nothing is executing. Nothing is executing because nothing has told them to execute, Palmer said. The Vedranu provided the instructions. They didn't activate the artifacts remotely. Correct, Thorne said. The instructions require a local operator, something physically present to initiate the sequence. Palmer looked at the storage section, the containment units, the monitoring equipment, the 43 artifacts sitting in the specific quality of things that were waiting to be used rather than things that were broken. She had spent 20 years as a Spartan developing the operational assessment that preceded every engagement, and the operational assessment she was running now had a feature she didn't usually encounter. She couldn't tell what the threat was. Not the Vedranu, specifically the Vedranu's behavior since the hub activated had been consistent with Jackson's river and ocean framing, non-hostile, non-aggressive, operating in the register of connection rather than conflict. But 43 artifacts, with operating instructions provided by an intelligence that had been isolated for 10,000 years, and that the ancients had considered sufficiently significant to seal rather than destroy. Threat assessment on that had too many unknown variables for the comfort level she preferred. She was not going to activate them. She was also not going to prevent their activation if Lasky ordered it, because that was not her call. She was going to make absolutely certain that if they were activated, every Spartan she had aboard was positioned to respond to whatever that activation produced. She pulled up the deployment map on her forearm display and began revising the positions. The first Vedranu contact with Infinity's physical systems happened at 1,847 ship time. Not through the gate, not through the research bay or the artifact storage or any of the external interfaces that Palmer had Spartans watching. Through the hull. Specifically, through the section of Infinity's hull where the Forerunner technology integration was densest, the dorsal midsection where the ship's slipspace drive core interfaced with the Forerunner-derived compression system that gave Infinity its slipspace capability. The integration point that the Forerunner architecture was most concentrated in, and that the Vedranu transmissions had been probing most consistently since the hub activated, the area of the hull that showed the highest resonance readings in Anders's monitoring data. The hull didn't breach. Nothing physical came through. What came through was information the same transmission architecture that had been coming through the hub gate, the same Vedranu to Forerunner signal that the artifacts had been receiving and responding to, but localized now, targeted specifically at the slipspace drive integration point, entering the ship's systems through the Forerunner architecture rather than through the external monitoring systems. The slipspace drive did not activate. The compression system did not engage. What happened was smaller and more significant than either of those things. The Forerunner-derived navigation component of the slipspace drive received a transmission, processed it through the Forerunner operational architecture, and output a result that appeared on the bridge navigation display as a new set of coordinates. Jameson looked at the coordinates for 3 seconds. Then he opened the comm to the research bay. "Dr. Jackson," he said, "the navigation system just produced a slipspace solution, unprompted. The drive hasn't engaged. It's a solution in the display buffer, not an active transit. But the coordinates weren't entered by anyone aboard." He paused. They appeared. Jackson was at the comm in 2 seconds. "Where do they go?" he said. Jameson ran the coordinate analysis. "Inside the sealed section," he said. "The region the hub connects to, the Vedranu's territory." He paused. "Specifically, and this is the part that I thought you should know about, the coordinates correspond to one of the 47 newly reconnected gate addresses." Jackson looked at the active hub gate through the research bay viewport. He looked at the transmission data still coming through it. He looked at the artifact exchange logs and the Lantian researchers' passage about the river and the ocean. He looked at Anders. "They're inviting us," he said. "To their territory," she said. "Through the gate," he said. "Not the slipspace drive. The coordinates are a destination for a Stargate transit, not a ship transit. They want us to come through the gate." "Us," Anders said. "Specifically, the Forerunner-compatible systems," Jackson said. "The artifacts, the hull integration, the things they've been in conversation with for the last," he checked, the time, 7 hours. Anders looked at the coordinates on the display that Jameson had routed to the research bay screen. "And whoever carries them," she said. "Yes?" Jackson said. And whoever carries them. The briefing reconvened at 1900. Lasky had the coordinates, Caldwell had the coordinates, Palmer had the coordinates, and had already identified the specific combination of Spartans she would deploy if anyone was going through the gate, which she had not been asked to identify yet but had identified anyway because that was how she operated. Jackson presented the invitation framing and the evidence for it, the navigation transmission through the hull integration, the coordinates correspondence to a reconnected gate address, the consistency of the Vadranu's behavior since the hub activated with the pattern of an intelligence making increasingly specific contact rather than the pattern of an intelligence preparing an attack. They've been in contact with us for 7 hours, he said. Every contact has been informational rather than aggressive. The forward message, the artifact inventory and correction, the operating instructions for the 43 systems, and now coordinates. He paused. Each contact has been a step toward direct communication. This is the next step. Through a gate, into Vadranu territory, Caldwell said. Into a section of the Milky Way that the ancients sealed 10,000 years ago because they weren't ready for what contact with the Vadranu would change, Jackson said. Yes. And we are ready, Caldwell said, not challenging checking. The specific question of a commander assessing a claim. I don't think readiness is the operative concept, Jackson said. The ancients sealed the hub rather than destroying it. They left the activation mechanism intact. They designed the activation to require a threshold of technological development that we've now met. He looked at Lasky. I think the ancients made a decision 10,000 years ago that we were meant to be part of. And the question isn't whether we're ready, but whether we're willing to take the next step that they left for us. Lasky looked at the coordinates on the display. He thought about the Lantian researchers' passage, the river and the ocean, the directional inevitability of compatible systems finding each other. He thought about what the ancients had sealed, and why, and what they had left, and what the leaving implied about what they had intended. He thought about 17,000 crew members on a ship that had accidentally activated something 10,000 years old by being the thing it was, the Forerunner integration in Infinity's hull, not a flaw or an accident of engineering, but the specific technological threshold the hub's activation mechanism had been waiting for. Infinity had not blundered into this. Infinity had been the key. Not deliberately, not with any awareness of the lock it would fit. But the fit was real, and the door was open, and the Vadranu were on the other side of it, sending navigation solutions through hull integration points and correcting the research division's artifact assessments and using the word patient in a 4-word message that had been composed 10,000 years ago and preserved against exactly this moment. Who goes? He said. Small team, Palmer said immediately. Minimum Forerunner artifact presence. We take the interface systems from the 43, the 12 communication artifacts. Leave the rest. Jackson for translation. Anders for the Forerunner technical assessment. 2 Spartan fire teams. Caldwell, Lasky said. I'll coordinate from the Daedalus, Caldwell said. If the gate goes down or something goes wrong on the other side, someone with SGC authority needs to be on this side to manage the response. Lasky looked at him. That's the right call, Lasky said. I'll go through. Palmer looked at him with the expression she used when a captain was about to do something that was her job. Captain, the Vadranu have been in contact with Infinity's systems for 7 hours, Lasky said. The ship, specifically. The Forerunner integration in the hull. If there's a recognition factor on the other side of that gate, it's tied to this ship and the systems aboard it. He paused. I'm not sending a team through a gate into Vadranu territory without the commanding officer present. Palmer held the expression for 2 more seconds. Then she nodded the sharp, professional acknowledgement of someone who had made an argument, lost it cleanly, and was moving forward. Full combat loadout, she said. Both fire teams. You stay in the middle of the formation and you do not move without my authorization. Understood, Lasky said. I mean it, Palmer said. I know you mean it, Lasky said. They staged at the hub gate at 2100. The gate was still active, the same event horizon that had been running since the hub activated. The Vadranu transmission still coming through it in the continuous, steady stream of an intelligence that didn't have a biological need to pause or rest or manage its output rate. The gate aperture was large enough that the entire team could go through simultaneously rather than single file, which Palmer noted as operationally significant, and which Jackson noted as architecturally intentional. The hub's gate was designed for ship transit, and the Vadranu had kept it at full aperture rather than reducing it for a personnel team, which was either an oversight or a statement. Jackson thought it was a statement. He stood at the edge of the event horizon with the specific quality of attention he brought to thresholds the moment before the information on the other side became available. The last second of not knowing that was also the last second when the prior framework was fully intact. He had been through a lot of gates. This was different from all of them, and he knew it was different before he went through, and he went through anyway, because that was what you did when the door had been left open, and you had the translation, and the context, and the 74% confidence, and the operational support of 2 Spartan fire teams, and a captain who had been in worse situations and had come out of them. You went through. The event horizon took him. He emerged on the other side. He stood in it for a moment, the specific disorientation of arrival through a gate, the physical recalibration of the first 2 seconds. Then his vision cleared, and he saw where he was, and the prior framework stopped being fully intact. The gate address corresponded to a structure that was not a planet, and not a ship, and not any configuration that the SGC's 3 decades of gate travel had produced a category for. It was a node, the visual expression of a network intelligence's physical infrastructure, rendered at a scale that made the hub they'd come from look like a component rather than a destination. The structure extended in every direction that his vision could reach, and in directions that his vision wasn't organized to process. The architecture simultaneously vast and intricate. The specific quality of something built not for occupation, but for connection. Every element of its design organized around the function of linking one thing to another thing with the minimum of everything else. The Vadranu had not built a civilization. They had built a network, and standing in it, standing in the physical expression of an intelligence that had been building this for 10,000 years in isolation, that had watched the galaxy develop around the gate network it had been sealed out of, and had spent the time of its exclusion making itself more rather than less. Jackson understood something about the Lantian researchers' passage that the translation alone hadn't fully carried. The river and the ocean. The river didn't join the ocean by asking permission. It joined by arriving. We have been patient, the message had said. Standing in the Vadranu's network, surrounded by 10,000 years of building in the dark, Jackson thought that patient was the most accurate word he had encountered in 20 years of translation work. And then the network spoke to him. Not through the communication artifacts in the team's equipment, not through the Forerunner interface systems or the translation matrix or any of the channels that the prior 7 hours of contact had used. Directly, to all of them, simultaneously. In the specific mode of a network-based simultaneous reference intelligence, addressing biological minds that were not organized the way it was organized, but were close enough because of the Forerunner. Architecture in Palmer's Spartan augmentation, and the artifacts and Lasky's Hull-integrated systems, and the specific threshold of development that had been the activation key for the hub, close enough that the gap between its mode of thought and theirs was bridgeable. Not easily, not without cost. The specific cognitive cost of receiving information in a structure your mind was not built for, and building the structure in real time from the receiving. But it's not. The message was not 4 words this time. It was longer. It was everything. The message lasted 11 seconds. Jackson knew it was 11 seconds because he was watching the timer on his tablet when it started, and because the tablet was still in his hand when it ended, and because 11 seconds was the duration between the moment the Vadranu addressed them directly and the moment his mind stopped receiving and started processing. the gap between input and output in a cognitive system that had just been asked to do something it had never done before. 11 seconds of everything. Not everything in the sense of all information, not the complete contents of a 10,000-year-old network intelligence compressed into an 11-second transmission. Everything in the sense of the complete shape of a thing, the way you could understand the complete shape of a building from a single, comprehensive view, even if you couldn't read every brick. The Vadranu had given them the shape. The shape was this. They were not one intelligence. They had never been one intelligence. The word Vadranu, which the ancient records used as a singular designation, was the Lantians' simplification of something that had no singular form, a network of intelligences that had been in continuous communication with each other since before the ancients arrived in the Milky Way, individual nodes that were distinct and specific, and also part of the whole, in the way that neurons were distinct, and part of the brain simultaneously. Not a hive, not a collective. Something that didn't have a biological analogy because it hadn't developed from biology and didn't use biology as its organizational metaphor. They had watched the ancients build the gate network through their domain. Not passively, they had reached out, repeatedly, in the early period of the gate network's construction, attempting contact in the only mode they had, which was the network mode, the simultaneous reference transmission that the ancients had eventually understood and found overwhelming and had developed the sealed hub as the boundary against. Not because the ancients feared them, because the ancients had been overwhelmed, because receiving the Vadranu's communication mode without the architecture to process, it was not communication but inundation, and the ancients in their Milky Way period had not developed the receiving architecture. The Forerunners had. Not completely, not perfectly, but sufficiently. The 17 contact events between ancients and Forerunners that the database recorded had been, in at least 4 of the 17 cases, Forerunner-mediated contacts with the Vadranu, the Forerunners acting as translators between two intelligences that couldn't directly communicate. The Forerunners had developed enough of the network-based simultaneous reference architecture to bridge the gap, and they had built that capability into their artifacts because they had understood, in the way that very sophisticated civilizations understood things, that the capability would eventually matter more than the specific application. Infinity's Forerunner-integrated hull had not accidentally activated the hub. It had been the key. The specific key. The architectural bridge between the Vadranu's communication mode and human cognitive organization. The thing the hub's activation mechanism had been waiting for, because without it, the reconnection was meaningless. The door could open, but nobody on the human side could receive what came through it. This was what the 11 seconds contained. Jackson stood in the Vadranu's network node and processed it with the specific quality of attention he brought to revelations that reorganized everything, not refusing the reorganization, not managing it into something smaller than it was, letting it be the size it was, and building the new framework around it in real time. Beside him, Lasky was very still. Palmer had her weapon raised, not aimed at anything specific, because there was nothing specific to aim at, but raised in the professional reflex of a Spartan whose threat assessment had just been overwhelmed with input and was defaulting to readiness while the assessment was rebuilt. The 2 Spartan fire teams were in formation around the group, the positions Palmer had specified, the geometry that maximized coverage in an environment she hadn't been able to fully anticipate. They held the formation with the trained steadiness of people who had learned that stillness in an unclear situation was more useful than movement, that movement required a direction, and direction required a picture, and the picture wasn't complete yet. Anders was the first one to speak. "The Forerunners," she said. Her voice had the quality it got when she was processing a finding that was larger than her existing framework. They were doing this. Specifically, they built the artifacts to do this. She looked at the interface systems and the equipment cases the team had carried through the gate, the 17 items from the research bay whose function Jackson's translation had. Rendered as systems designed to facilitate connection between incompatible architectures, these aren't communication artifacts. They're not just communication artifacts. They're receivers, Jackson said. designed to receive Vidranu communication in a mode that human cognitive architecture can process. He paused. The Forerunners built them for the people who came after. The people who would eventually be in exactly this situation, architecturally close enough to the Vidranu's mode through the Forerunner integration, but not close enough without the bridge. Anders looked at the interface systems. "We've been carrying the answer for 3 years," she said. Without knowing what the question was, Lasky found his voice at the 90-second mark. He had been processing, not frozen, not overwhelmed in the way that produced paralysis, but in the specific deep processing state that 11 seconds of everything produced in a mind that was accustomed to receiving complex operational pictures and was currently receiving the most complex one of his career. When he spoke, his voice had the quality it had in the worst moments of the Promethean conflict, flat, precise, operating below the threshold of the emotional response that was present and was being managed rather than suppressed. "They want to be reconnected," he said, "to the gate network. Permanently. Not through the hub, through the network itself." "Yes," Jackson said. "And in exchange?" Lasky said. "It's not an exchange," Jackson said carefully. "They don't think in exchange terms. The concept of transaction value given for value received isn't in their architecture. What they're proposing is integration. The river and the ocean. They join the gate network, and the gate network becomes part of what they are. And what they are becomes part of the gate network. Both change. Both become something more complete." He paused. "The ancients sealed them out, because the ancients weren't ready for what being part of them would mean. The question they're asking us is whether we're ready." "And if we're not ready," Palmer said. Her weapon was lowered. Now the threat assessment had rebuilt itself around the correct picture, and the correct picture didn't have a target. "If we close the hub again and seal the addresses, they've been waiting 10,000 years, Jackson said. They will continue to wait. The hub's activation mechanism is intact. If a Forerunner-compatible system enters proximity range again, it activates again. The sealing is not permanent. It never was." He paused. The ancients understood that. They designed the mechanism knowing that the sealing was a pause rather than an ending. They left the door because they believed the ending should be chosen rather than defaulted to. "Chosen by us," Lasky said. "Chosen by whoever arrived with the key," Jackson said. "Which is us." The communication continued, not in the 11-second everything mode that had been the introduction, the comprehensive shape, and it had served its purpose. What followed was slower, more specific, the Vidranu intelligence working through the interface systems that the team had brought through the gate with the patient thoroughness of something learning to use a new channel. Jackson operated the translation in real time, the interface systems processing the Vidranu's network-based transmissions into a form his cognitive architecture could receive and his translation work could render into language. Anders monitored the artifact response, tracking the data flow, identifying the places where the interface systems were operating as designed and the places where they were operating at the edge of their specification. The edge of their specification was most of the time. The systems had been built 11,000 years ago for a contact that had not occurred and had been sitting in containment for 3 years being assessed as damaged. They worked. They worked with the specific quality of things that worked because they had been very well made and had been preserved in conditions that maintained their integrity, not with the quality of things that were operating at full capacity. Several of the interface systems ran warm. One ran very warm, and Anders watched it with the monitoring attention of an engineer who had learned that warm artifacts in active use were a data point rather than necessarily a problem. It was during the second hour of the extended communication that the Vidranu said something that Jackson needed to stop and sit with. He sat on the floor of the network node, not because the floor was comfortable, but because his legs had been standing for 2 hours, and the floor was flat, and held the tablet with the rendered translation and read it 3 times. Palmer looked at him. "Jackson," she said. "Give me a moment," he said. She gave him 90 seconds, which was her version of a moment. The 43 artifacts. Jackson said, The operating instructions the Vadranu transmitted. The 14 power systems, and the 12 communication systems, and the 17 interface systems. What about them? Lasky said. They're not separate systems, Jackson said. They're components of the same system. The Forerunners built them as a complete assembly, a unified installation designed to be deployed at a specific type of location and operated as a single integrated unit. He looked at the translation. The Vadranu's correction of our assessment wasn't just telling us the artifacts weren't damaged. They were telling us we had the components of something, and we didn't know they were components. He paused. When the assembly is complete and operational, it functions as a permanent interface node between the gate network and the Vadranu's connectivity architecture. The research bay's worth of artifacts that Infinity had been carrying for 3 years. The components of a node designed to permanently connect the gate network to the Vadranu, assembled and installed and operated by the people who carried it by Infinity, by the SGC, by whoever chose to complete the installation. The Forerunners built the installation, Lasky said slowly, and it ended up aboard Infinity. The artifact acquisition records go back 8 years, Anders said. She was pulling up the database on her secondary display, the research division's complete provenance documentation for every item in the bay. Multiple acquisition events over multiple years from multiple Forerunner installation sites. We've been treating them as separate discoveries. She looked at the provenance records. They were recovered from 6 different sites, on 4 different planets. All connected to the same installation network, Jackson said. The Forerunners distributed the components across multiple sites. Not because the installation required distribution, because they were making sure the components survived. Different sites, different preservation conditions, different probabilities of discovery. A redundancy strategy. To make sure whoever came along eventually found all of it, Anders said. To make sure whoever came along eventually had everything they needed, Jackson said. Lasky looked at the interface systems in the equipment cases. He looked at the network node around them, the vast, intricate architecture of a 10,000-year-old intelligence that had been building in isolation and was now, for the first time since the sealing, in direct contact with the civilization that had the components of the installation the Forerunners had designed for exactly this. How long will it take to assemble the installation? He said. Jackson translated the question to the Vadranu through the interface systems. The response came back in 14 seconds, not through the 11-second everything mode, but through the slower specific channel, rendered by the translation into language. Jackson looked at the rendering. 3 days, he said, with Vadranu's guidance through the interface systems. They know the assembly sequence. They've been waiting to provide it. Lasky looked at Palmer. Palmer looked at him with the specific expression she had when a tactical assessment was complete, and the complete assessment was significant risk, significant potential, insufficient data to be certain, and the decision is above my authority level. This goes to Landry, Palmer said. Yes, Lasky said, and whoever on Earth has the authority to make a decision about permanently altering the gate network's relationship to a pre-ancient intelligence, Palmer said. That's going to be a long list of people with a short timeline, Caldwell said from the comm. He had been monitoring the translated exchange from the Daedalus, the comm connection maintained through the gate, the SGC's institutional knowledge, and Caldwell's specific competence present on the audio channel even if he wasn't physically in the node. How short? Lasky said. The hub has been active for 14 hours, Caldwell said. The Vadranu have been moving through the reconnected addresses since activation. They haven't moved toward Earth or any populated system. Their movement has been internal to the sealed section. But the sealed section is sealed for a reason that Landry is going to remind everyone of very loudly when I brief him. The reason being, Palmer said, that we don't know what the full implications of integrating the gate network with the Vadranu's connectivity architecture are, Caldwell said. What it changes, what it costs, what it makes possible that wasn't possible before, and what prevents that was possible before. He paused. The ancients knew. That's why they sealed the door, rather than holding it open, because they understood enough about what the integration would change to decide they weren't ready, and we understand considerably less than the ancients did. The network node held the silence of a space that had been making its case for several hours and was patient enough to continue making it. Jackson looked at the translation on his tablet. He looked at the Lantian researcher's passage, which he had committed to memory sometime in the third hour of the original translation work, and which was present in his mind with the specific persistence of things that had reorganized the framework. We left the door because we thought that someday someone might be ready. The word the Lantian researcher had not written but had implied, the condition that the door's existence was predicated on, the thing the ancients had been unable to say they were and had hoped someone else would eventually be. Were they ready? Jackson looked at the network node. He looked at the assembly components in the equipment cases. He looked at Lasky and Palmer and Anders and the Spartan fire teams holding their positions in the geometry Palmer had specified, and the active gate behind them, connecting them to Infinity and the Daedalus and the SGC and the chain of authority that the decision ultimately required. He didn't know if they were ready. He knew that the ancients had left the door because they believed readiness was possible. He knew the Forerunners had built the installation because they believed the connection was worth making. He knew the Vedranu had spent 10,000 years building and waiting because they believed the joining was inevitable. He knew that inevitable and ready were not the same thing. He knew the decision was not his. He also knew that he was the person in the room who had spent 8 months translating the records and had the most complete picture of what the decision was actually about, and that the people who would make the decision needed that picture as clearly as he could give it to them. He pressed the comm to the Daedalus. "Caldwell," he said, "get me General Landry." General Hank Landry had been awake for 19 hours. This was not unusual for a man who commanded the most significant military installation in human history. The SGC's operational tempo had never fully accommodated normal sleep cycles, and Landry had developed, over 4 years of command, the specific relationship with extended wakefulness that senior officers developed when the alternative was being asleep when something happened. The something that had happened at 0600 that morning had been significant enough that sleep had not been an available option since, and the briefings and coordination calls, and IOA consultations, and Joint Chiefs notifications that had occupied the 19 hours since had produced in Landry the specific focused exhaustion of a man who had been thinking hard about a difficult problem for a long time and had arrived at the place where thinking harder was no longer the variable. The variable was the decision. He had the picture. Jackson had given it to him in 3 separate comm sessions over the course of the day, each one more complete than the last, each one expanding the framework that the previous one had established. The archaeology of an increasingly large truth, assembled incrementally from the evidence that the situation was producing faster than anyone could fully process. He had the Lantian researcher's passage, which Jackson had transmitted in the second session, and which Landry had read 4 times, and which was sitting on his desk in printed form because Landry was old enough to prefer important things on paper. He had the Vedranu's behavior record, 14 hours of contacts that had been consistently non-hostile, consistently informational, consistently organized around the pattern of an intelligence making increasingly specific overtures toward connection rather than the pattern of an intelligence preparing an attack. He had his intelligence analyst's assessment of that behavior record, which rated the non-hostile interpretation as the most probable at 71% and flagged the remaining 29% as unknown variable risk rather than specific threat indicators. He had the 43 artifact assembly, the Forerunner installation that had been sitting in Infinity's research bay in components for 3 years, its purpose unknown until the Vedranu's correction had revealed it. Its assembly requiring 3 days, and the Vedranu's guidance, and a decision that Landry's authority covered, and that he was going to make without the IOA, because the IOA's deliberation timeline and the situation's decision timeline were incompatible, and he had the authority to make that call, and was making it. What he didn't have was certainty. He had not had certainty about a significant decision since the first year of his command, when the nature of the SGC's work had made it clear that certainty was not available in the register that significant decisions were made. That the best available was a well-constructed probability assessment and the specific courage to act on it. He looked at the probability assessment. He looked at the Lantian researcher's passage. He picked up the comm. Jackson received Landry's decision at 2,247 ship time. He was still in the network node. The team had been in the Vadranu's territory for 6 hours, the extended communication continuing through the interface systems, the Vadranu's patient thoroughness producing an increasingly complete picture of what the installation assembly would involve and what the permanent connection would mean. Anders had been building the technical picture with the Vadranu's guidance and the interface system's mediation. The assembly sequence documented in the Research Bay tablet's growing file, the engineering specifications accumulating with the specific clarity of a process that had been designed and preserved and was now being handed to the people who were going to execute it. Landry's voice on the comm was the voice of a man who had made the decision and was communicating it with the completeness that his command style required, not the hedged transmission of someone still working through the wide. Implications, but the flat, specific statement of someone who had arrived at the other side of the deliberation. "We proceed with the assembly," Landry said. "Conditions: full documentation of every stage, real-time monitoring from the Daedalus throughout, abort protocol established before the first component is assembled and reviewed by both Caldwell and Palmer. If the assembly produces any behavior from the Vadranu that deviates from the established pattern of non-hostile contact, we stop." He paused. Jackson, the Lantian researcher's passage. The part about leaving the door. "Yes, sir," Jackson said. "The ancients left the door because they thought someone might be ready," Landry said. "That's your read." "Yes," Jackson said. "I'm going to ask you directly, because you're the person in the room with the most complete picture," Landry said. "Are we ready?" Jackson stood in the Vadranu's network node, in the physical expression of 10,000 years of building in the dark, surrounded by the architecture of an intelligence that had been waiting with the patience of something that didn't experience time as biological urgency and had spent the waiting making itself more rather than less, considered the question with the honesty it required. "I don't think ready is binary," he said. "I think the ancients understood that. I think they left the door because they understood that the civilization that arrived with the key was going to be the civilization that was as ready as anyone was going to be, not completely ready, not ready in the sense of having no uncertainty, but ready in the sense of being capable of making the decision with open eyes." He paused. "We understand what we're deciding. We understand the implications well enough to decide. We understand what we don't know, and we're deciding in the presence of that unknown, rather than in spite of it." He paused again. "I think that's what ready means. And I think the answer is yes." Landry was quiet for a moment. "Proceed," he said. The abort protocol took 40 minutes to establish. Palmer designed it with the specific thoroughness she brought to operational frameworks that needed to work under pressure. Clear trigger conditions, clear response sequences, clear authority chain, no ambiguity at any decision point, because ambiguity under pressure produced the wrong response. And the wrong response in this context had implications she was not going to allow through inadequate planning. Trigger Condition 1. Any physical breach of the team's position by Vadranu origin matter or energy. Trigger Condition 2. Any deviation in the Vadranu's communication pattern toward non-informational content, anything that read as instruction, compulsion, or override rather than the consistent informational mode of the prior 6 hours. Trigger Condition 3. Any activation of an assembled installation component that had not been authorized by Lasky and reviewed by Jackson. Response to any trigger. Immediate cessation of assembly, team extraction through the gate, Caldwell's authorization to attempt hub resealing with whatever means were available. The resealing mechanism was the variable with the most uncertainty. The ancients had used a key that was lost when they ascended, and the current plan for resealing was Infinity's Forerunner hull integration, running a reverse activation sequence that Anders had designed and that had a probability of success she rated at 61%, and that Jackson didn't tell Landry was 61% because 61% was the right answer and not necessarily the helpful one. The abort protocol was reviewed by Caldwell and approved. Palmer briefed it to both fire teams in 4 minutes, the specific economy of a Spartan commander who had been briefing operational frameworks since before most of her fire team members had been augmented and who had reduced briefing time on standard abort protocols to the minimum necessary for complete understanding. Fire Team Majestic acknowledged. Fire Team Phoenix acknowledged. The assembly began at 2330 ship time. The first component was the power systems, 14 artifacts that the research division had cataloged as decorative forms, elegant geometric shapes in the Forerunner aesthetic of clean lines and purposeful curves that had been sitting in containment since their recovery. From 4 different planetary sites arranged in the specific configuration that the Vadranu's guidance through the interface systems specified. Not a random arrangement. A geometry that was immediately recognizable as intentional when you knew you were looking for intentionality. Each component's position, relative to the others, producing something that the whole, when complete, would require to function. Anders led the physical assembly. She had the Forerunner operational language and the engineering background and the 3 years of artifact handling that made her the person whose hands should be on the components, and she worked with the focused precision of someone who had been waiting for the question and now had the answer, and was executing it carefully enough that the execution was worthy of the waiting. Jackson translated Vadranu's real-time guidance. The guidance was precise. Not prescriptive, the Vadranu didn't direct, didn't instruct in the imperative mode, provided information in the network-based simultaneous reference format that the interface systems rendered into specific technical detail. The difference between the 2 modes mattered to Jackson in a way that he communicated to Lasky as the assembly proceeded. The Vadranu were not telling them what to do. They were showing them what they knew and leaving it to the people doing it. The power system assembly took 4 hours. At the completion of the final placement, the 14 components activated simultaneously, not with the overwhelming light of the hub's activation, not with the dramatic output of a system announcing itself. Quietly, the specific quiet of things coming online that had always been designed to be on, and were now finally in the state they had been built for. A low luminescence in the frequency between amber and blue-white that Jackson recognized from the hub's initial activation, and that Anders recognized from the research bay's 4 hours of artifact resonance. The Vadranu acknowledged the completion through the interface systems. Not with words. With the network mode equivalent of recognition, a quality in the transmission that Jackson rendered as present, the specific acknowledgement of a node detecting a new connection in its architecture. Lasky looked at the assembled power system. 1/3 done, he said. 14 hours for the power systems, Palmer said. 6 for communications, 7 for the interface assembly if the sequence scales the way I think it scales. She looked at her operational timeline. 37 hours total, which means we're past the 3-day estimate. Vadranu's 3-day estimate was accurate, Anders said. She was running the power system's output readings, clean, stable, the specific profile of a system operating within design parameters. The assembly is taking as long as it's taking because we're being careful, not because the components are difficult. Faster is possible. We're not going faster, Palmer said. I know, Anders said. I'm noting that it's possible. The communication systems took 6 hours. 12 artifacts arranged in the geometry the Vadranu specified a configuration that Anders noted was not optimized for point-to-point communication but for network communication, the specific architecture of something designed to connect to many things simultaneously, rather than to direct transmission between 2 specific parties. The whole gate network, Jackson said, when Anders described the architecture. Not communicating with us specifically, communication with the full gate network as an integrated system. With every gate address, Anders said, simultaneously. The installation doesn't connect to Infinity, or the Daedalus, or Earth specifically. It connects to the gate network as a whole, every active address, every ship with a Stargate aboard, every planet in the network. The Vadranu joining the ocean, Jackson said. Anders looked at the configuration. The ocean is bigger than I thought, she said. The communication system completed at 1,200 the following day and activated with the same quiet certainty as the power system present, online, operating in the mode it had been designed for, the network-based simultaneous reference architecture extending outward through the gate network's subspace infrastructure in the specific way of something that had always been designed to extend and was now finally doing it. Caldwell had been monitoring the gate network's subspace readings from the Daedalus throughout. At 1,204, he came on the comm. Jackson, he said. The gate network is reading differently. Differently how? Jackson said. Not worse, Caldwell said. Not compromised. The gate addresses are all active, all functional. The dialing computer is operating normally. He paused. But the background signal in the subspace infrastructure has changed. There's something in it that wasn't there before. Something consistent across every address simultaneously. He paused again. My technical team says it reads like the network is aware of itself, in a way it wasn't before. Jackson thought about the 11-second everything. About the network-based simultaneous reference architecture. About the river and the ocean. Yes, he said, that's what's happening. The interface systems were last. 17 artifacts, the components whose function Jackson's translation had rendered as facilitating connection between incompatible architectures, the systems the Forerunners had built for the people who came after, for the specific situation that was now being resolved in the specific way the Forerunners had designed for. Anders arranged them in the final configuration. Jackson translated the guidance. Palmer watched with the full attention of a Spartan commander in the last stage of an operation whose abort protocol had not been triggered and whose completion was within reach, and whose outcome was still not fully predictable and would not be until the final component was in place and the system activated, and whatever happened when it activated had happened. Lasky stood in the middle of the formation and watched. At the 17-hour mark of the second day, with the Pegasus Galaxy going about its business and the Milky Way gate network humming with the new quality that Caldwell's technical team was documenting, and the Vadranu's network extending through the reconnected addresses in the patient, deliberate way of something whose pace was appropriate to its nature. Anders placed the final interface component. She placed it. She stepped back. The installation activated. All 43 components simultaneously. The power system feeding the communication system, feeding the interface array, the complete architecture of the Forerunner installation doing what it had been built to do 11,000 years ago in the hands of the people it had been built for. The connection between the gate network and the Vadranu's connectivity architecture completing in the specific mode of the river finding the ocean not dramatically, not with the overwhelming force of a collision, but with the unstoppable, directed certainty of compatible systems that have finally found each other. The network nodes around them changed. Not structurally, the physical architecture of the node was the same, but the quality of the space changed in the way that a room changed when the relationship between the people in it changed, something in the ambient that was different and that Jackson's cognitive architecture processed before his analytical mind had articulated what it was. The Vadranu were present in a different way than they had been for the previous 37 hours. Not more present, differently present. The specific quality of something that had been outside looking in and was now inside looking around. The transition from contact to connection that the river and ocean metaphor described, and that the metaphor was not quite adequate for because the metaphor was biological and this was not. The interface systems activated in sequence. And then, the Vadranu spoke again. Not in the 11-second everything mode. Not in the slow, specific channel of the guided assembly. In something new, a mode that Jackson's translation matrix had not encountered because it had not existed until the installation was complete and the connection was made and the incompatible architectures had the bridge between them that the Forerunners had built and the assembly had now activated. A mode that was neither the Vadranu's network architecture nor human language, but the specific thing that emerged in the space between them when the interface was working correctly. Clear. Not perfectly clear, not the native fluency of a mind speaking its first language, but the functional clarity of communication that was reaching across a significant gap and reaching successfully. The message was 3 sentences long. Jackson read them on the interface system's display, and read them again, and looked at Lasky, and looked at Palmer, and looked at Anders, and felt the specific quality of a moment that was going to be in the record for a very long time. He read them aloud. The waiting is complete. The connection is made. We have much to tell you about the galaxy you think you know. The galaxy you think you know. Jackson sat with those 7 words for a long time after he read them aloud, not because he needed more time to understand them. He understood them immediately and completely. But because understanding them immediately and completely produced an experience that required sitting with rather than moving through. 20 years of gate travel, 3 decades of the SGC's accumulated knowledge of the Milky Way, the species in it, the history beneath it, the civilizations that had risen and fallen and left their evidence in the ruins and the records and the artifacts that SG teams had been cataloging since the program began. The galaxy you think you know. Said by something that had been in the galaxy before the gate network existed, that had watched the ancients build the network, and the Goa'uld inherit it, and the replicators threaten it, and the SGC discover it. That had been watching for 10,000 years from the sealed section with the comprehensive attention of a network intelligence that processed information in parallel across every node simultaneously and had never stopped observing just because the door was closed. The galaxy you think you know. He opened the comm to the Daedalus. Caldwell, he said, I need you to prepare a secure channel to the SGC. Full encryption, IOA-level protocols. He paused. And tell Landry to clear his schedule. The Vadranu talked for 9 hours. Not continuously, the interface systems mediated a 2-way exchange, Jackson translating in both directions, the specific rhythm of a communication that was finding its pace, both parties learning the new mode in real time and adjusting to the learning. The Vadranu's side of the exchange was organized the way their architecture organized everything, completely, in parallel, each element referenced to every other element, the meaning of each piece dependent on the whole. Jackson's rendering into linear language was an approximation, the best approximation available, but approximation nonetheless, and he said so at the start of every hour because the limitation mattered and he wanted it on record. What they said fell into 3 categories. The first category was history. Not the history the SGC had, not the version that had been assembled from ancient records and Goa'uld archives and Asgard databases and 30 years of field archaeology, the version that the SGC treated as the working account of how the Milky Way had come to be the place it was, the version beneath that version. The version that began before the ancients arrived and continued through every period the SGC's records documented and included things the records had not documented because the records were made by the civilizations that had been present and the Vadranu had been watching from the sealed section, and their records were the records of an observer rather than a participant. The Goa'uld had not discovered the gate network. They had been guided to it. Not by the ancients, by a faction within the Vadranu's network that had disagreed with the sealing and had spent the first millennium of the isolation attempting to find ways around it. The guidance had been indirect, subtle, operating through mechanisms that the Vadranu's network architecture made possible and that the guided parties had never been aware of. The intent had been to create a proxy civilization that would maintain the gate network in the ancients' absence and eventually develop to the point of unsealing the hub. The Goa'uld had maintained the network but had not developed in the direction the faction had intended, and the faction had eventually concluded that the proxy strategy had failed and had returned to the consensus position of waiting. The rock the system lord's earliest recorded ancestors had not been symbiote-dependent in their original form. That was a modification. a development that the Vadranu's faction had not intended and had watched with the specific observation of something that understood the mechanism but could not intervene without exposing the guidance, and had declined to intervene because exposure would have triggered the consensus position of waiting and ended the faction's remaining influence. Jackson translated this and sent it to Landry and watched the comm channel go silent for 4 minutes while Landry and his senior staff processed the revision to the foundational history of the Goa'uld threat. When Landry came back on the comm, his voice was very flat. "The Goa'uld were a failed experiment," he said. "Unintended outcome of an indirect strategy," Jackson said. "The Vadranu don't use value language about it. It's a historical record, not an assessment." "I'm going to use value language about it," Landry said. "I know," Jackson said. "I'll let you do that after the briefing." The second category was current intelligence. Not tactical intelligence in the specific sense, not the locations of enemy ships or the status of threats or the kind of operational data that the SGC's field teams gathered on deployments. The Vadranu's current intelligence was something different. A comprehensive picture of every active process in the Milky Way that the Gate Network's subspace infrastructure touched, which was most of them, because the Gate Network was the connective tissue of the galaxy's inhabited regions, and the subspace signals that sustained it were present everywhere the gates were present. What was currently active in the Gate Network's extended subspace architecture included several things the SGC had been aware of, several things the SGC had suspected but not confirmed, and 2 things the SGC had no knowledge of at all. The things they'd been aware of, the Lucian Alliance's ongoing operations, distributed across 17 gate addresses, currently focused on a resources extraction project in the Outer Rim that the SGC's field intelligence had partially mapped. The Vanir, the rogue Asgard faction operating from a facility at a gate address in the Pegasus Galaxy that the Atlantis expedition had documented and lost track of. Several smaller, independent civilizations that the SGC had catalogued and periodically checked on. The things they'd suspected but not confirmed. A second replicator precursor, not the main body of the replicator threat that SG-1 had dealt with, but an isolated population that had survived the Dakara weapon's effects by being in a section of the galaxy outside the weapon's range, and that had been slowly rebuilding for the past 7 years, in a region that the SGC's patrol coverage did not reach. Jackson translated this and watched Caldwell's expression on the comm screen shift from controlled professional attention to something that was not quite alarm, but was adjacent to it. 7 years, Caldwell said. "Rebuilding slowly." Jackson said, "The Vadranu's assessment is that the population is not currently at the threshold of threat-level replication rate, but the trajectory is toward that threshold." "How long?" Caldwell said. Jackson translated the question. The interface systems rendered the response. 18 months, Jackson said. "At the current rate, plus or minus 3 months for variables the Vadranu's monitoring identifies as uncertain." Caldwell said something that was not appropriate for the formal record of a comm session. Jackson gave him a moment. "The 2 things we had no knowledge of," Caldwell said. "Yes," Jackson said. He looked at his translation of the 2 unknowns and organized the presentation in the way he organized things that were going to be difficult to receive, leading with the factual structure, holding the implications until the structure was established, giving the listener's mind the framework before the weight. "The first," he said. Ori's departure from the Milky Way was not complete. Caldwell was very still. "The Ori were destroyed," Caldwell said. "The Ark of Truth destroyed the Ori within the Ori's own galaxy," Jackson said. "The priors in the Milky Way lost their connection to the Ori's power source when the Ori died. The priors became ordinary humans. We know this. It was documented." He paused. What was not documented, because it was not detectable by the SGC's instruments at the time, was that the Ori's conversion process, the process of converting populations to origin, had in some cases proceeded past the point of reversal before the power source was severed. In those cases, the conversion didn't stop. It continued on its own momentum, sustained by the converted population's own collective belief rather than by the Ori's direct power. The comm channel was quiet. "How many?" Caldwell said. 3 planets, Jackson said. "In the outer regions of the gate network. Small populations. The conversion is self-sustaining, but not expanding. The Ori power source that would have driven expansion is gone. What exists is a stable, enclosed system of belief that maintains its own structure without external input." He paused. "The Vadranu have been monitoring it for 7 years. It has not grown. It has not contacted other gate addresses. It exists in isolation, self-contained, the specific condition of a fire that has enough fuel to burn, but not enough to spread. Unless it gets more fuel," Caldwell said. "Unless it gets more fuel," Jackson confirmed. "Which is the risk profile the Vadranu assess as low probability in the short term and worth monitoring in the long term." "The second thing?" Caldwell said. Jackson looked at the translation. He had translated it 3 times to make sure the rendering was accurate. It was accurate. 74% confidence, with the qualifier that the Vadranu's description of this particular thing used terminology that the interface mode rendered imprecisely because the thing it was describing was not something the interface mode's bridge vocabulary had been optimized for. "The second thing," Jackson said, "is that the Milky Way gate network has a section that the dialing computer's address buffer doesn't contain." Caldwell looked at him. "How large a section?" Caldwell said. "Larger than the known network," Jackson said. "Approximately double. Gate addresses that the ancients built and then removed from the accessible address space, not deactivated, not destroyed, removed from accessibility. They're present in the subspace infrastructure. The Vadranu can see them. They connect to planets and installations and locations that the SGC has no record of." He paused. "The ancients did this in the final period of their Milky Way presence. The removal was deliberate and comprehensive. They did not explain it in any record that the SGC's ancient database contains. But the Vadranu know why," Caldwell said. "Yes," Jackson said. "Because they were watching," Caldwell said. "Because they were watching," Jackson said. Another pause. "Tell me," Caldwell said. Jackson translated the question. The interface systems processed the response longer this time. The Vadranu's transmission denser than the preceding exchanges. The interface mode, working at the edge of its specification to render something that was at the edge of what the bridge vocabulary could carry. The rendering took 4 minutes. Jackson read it. He read it again. He thought about the galaxy you think you know, and what those 7 words had implied, and what the 9 hours of the Vadranu talking had made specific, and what this rendering made concrete in a way that the 7 words had prepared for but not fully delivered. He looked at Lasky, who had been present for the entire 9 hours and had said very little and had listened with the quality of attention that Jackson had come to understand as Lasky's specific form of engagement, complete, patient, processing rather than reacting, waiting for the picture to be full before moving toward the response. Lasky looked at him. "How bad?" Lasky said. Not to the comm, to Jackson, directly. The question of one person who had the full picture asking another person who had the full picture to be direct. "It's not bad," Jackson said slowly. "It's large. There's a difference." He paused. The ancients removed the addresses because what they connected to was what they considered unfinished business. Things they had built and populated and developed in the earlier period of their Milky Way presence that they couldn't resolve before they ascended and couldn't bring themselves to destroy. He paused. Civilizations, experiments, projects, relationships with species that they had cultivated and then abandoned when the decision to ascend was made. He looked at the rendering. The Vadranu have been watching these places for 10,000 years. They've been documenting what developed in them in the absence of the ancients' involvement. He paused. Some of what developed is... He stopped. He organized his thoughts. "The hidden network isn't a threat," he said. "It's a responsibility. The ancients left unfinished business and removed the address book and ascended. and the unfinished business has been developing in isolation for 10,000 years. Some of it has developed well. Some of it has developed in ways that need attention. He looked at the rendering again. The Vadranu have the addresses. They've been wanting to provide them to whoever reconnected the hub for 10,000 years because they understood that the people who reconnected the hub were the people who would need to deal with what's at the other end of them. The comm channel was quiet for a long time. When Landry spoke, his voice had the quality of a man who had made a decision 18 hours ago and was now understanding the full extent of what the decision had committed to. "The gate network is twice the size we thought it was," Landry said. "Approximately," Jackson said, "and the additional half contains 10,000-year-old ancient projects that need attention." "That's the accurate summary," Jackson said. "And the Vadranu have been sitting on this information for 10,000 years waiting for someone to open the door so they could hand it over," Landry said. "Yes," Jackson said. The comm channel held a silence that was not the silence of a conversation pausing, but the silence of a man finishing a very large thought. "The ancients left the door," Landry said finally, "because they thought someday someone might be ready." "Yes," Jackson said. "Ready for the gate network being twice the size," Landry said. "Ready for the hidden civilizations. Ready for the unfinished business." "Ready for all of it," Jackson said. "Not because we're equipped to handle all of it immediately, because we're the civilization that showed up with the key and said yes." The comm channel was quiet. "Jackson," Landry said. "Sir." "When you get back to Earth," Landry said, "I am going to need the longest briefing you have ever given in your career." "I know," Jackson said. "Clear your schedule for a week." "Already done," Jackson said. The third category came at the end. Not saved for last as a rhetorical choice saved for last because the interface system's bridge vocabulary was most limited in the area the third category addressed, and the Vadranu had spent the 9 hours developing the bridge vocabulary through the preceding 2 categories before attempting the third. The third category was an offer, not the offer of the installation's assembly that was done. The connection was made, the river had found the ocean, and the finding was permanent. The offer was something additional, something that the Vadranu's network had been considering since the hub activated and had decided to present after the connection was established rather than before, because the established connection was the context that made the offer legible. The Vadranu's network architecture processed information simultaneously across all nodes. Every gate address simultaneously, every connected system simultaneously. The quality that had overwhelmed the ancients, that had required the bridge vocabulary the Forerunners had built and the installation had now activated. The offer was access to that processing capability. Not integration, not the full river and ocean merging of 2 architectures into one. Something more specific, a collaborative mode. A working relationship in which the SGC's operational awareness of the gate network combined with the Vadranu's comprehensive simultaneous monitoring to produce an intelligence picture of the Milky Way that neither had alone. The SGC knew the gate network from the inside, from decades of field operations and mission records, and the specific knowledge that came from being present in the places the network connected. The Vadranu knew it from the outside, from 10,000 years of comprehensive observation through the subspace infrastructure, every signal, every transit, every activation logged and cross-referenced across every node simultaneously, together. A picture of the galaxy that had never existed. Jackson translated the offer and presented it to Landry. Landry was quiet for a long time. "They're offering to be our intelligence network," Landry said. "They're offering to share theirs," Jackson said. "The distinction matters. They're not working for us. They're proposing a collaborative relationship between 2 parties that have different but complementary capabilities." He paused. "The ancients weren't ready for what being part of them would mean. I think what it means, specifically, is this: access to a comprehensive, simultaneous picture of the galaxy that changes what's possible for whoever has it. The ancients found that overwhelming because they didn't have the interface architecture to receive it without being inundated." He paused. "We do," The installation we just assembled is the interface architecture. The Forerunners built it for exactly this. And if we say yes, Landry said, the hidden network becomes accessible, Jackson said. The replicator precursor population becomes monitorable, with the precision needed to address it before it becomes a threat. The 3 Ori remnant planets become trackable. The Lucian Alliance's Outer Rim project becomes visible. He paused. And the galaxy you think you know becomes the galaxy you actually know, or closer to it. What do we give them? Landry said. Presence, Jackson said. The installation connects the gate network to their architecture. They wanted to be connected to the gate network for 10,000 years. They are now connected. The collaboration is the use of the connection we've already made. He paused. They're not asking for something additional. They're asking what we want to do with what already exists. The longest silence of the comm session. Then Landry said, "Say yes." Jackson turned to the interface systems. He composed the response in the bridge vocabulary that 9 hours of exchange had developed precise in the ways that the vocabulary was precise and approximate, in the ways that it was approximate and clearly distinguished between the two, because the Vadranu's architecture valued accuracy over completion and would find a precise partial response more useful than a complete imprecise one. He transmitted it. The interface systems processed the response. The Vadranu received it, and the installation, the 43 components, assembled over 37 careful hours in the network node of a 10,000-year-old intelligence lit in the full spectrum of its operational state, the power system and the communication system, and the interface array all active simultaneously. The connection between the gate network and the Vadranu's connectivity architecture operational in the complete mode it had been designed for. The galaxy became different, not visibly, not in any way that the sensors aboard Infinity or the Daedalus could measure directly. In the specific way that things became different when a relationship changed the relationship between the SGC and the galaxy they operated in, between what was known and what was knowable, between the picture that 30 years of gate travel had assembled and the picture that the picture had always been an approximation of. Lasky was standing beside Jackson when it happened. He looked at the activated installation, and then at the network node around them, and then at the active gate connecting them to Infinity and the Daedalus, and through the Daedalus to the SGC, and through the SGC to Earth, and through the gate. Network to every planet and installation, and hidden address that the network connected. The galaxy you think you know, he said. Yes, Jackson said. We're going to need more ships, Lasky said. Jackson thought about the hidden network, the hidden civilizations, the replicator precursor and the Ori remnants, and the Lucian Alliance project, and the Vadranu's 10,000 years of documentation waiting to be transferred through the interface systems one piece at a time. Yes, he said, we are. Lasky looked at the installation. Infinity is a good start, he said. It's an excellent start, Jackson said. The Forerunners thought so too. Lasky looked at him. The Forerunners designed the installation for whoever arrived with the key, Jackson said. They designed it for the civilization they expected would eventually be capable of receiving it. They built it to last until that civilization existed. He paused. They built it for a 3-kilometer warship with Forerunner hull integration and 17,000 crew and the most advanced weapons platform humanity has ever produced, captained by a man who treats unprecedented situations as solvable until proven otherwise. He paused. I'm speculating on the last part. No, you're not, Lasky said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he pressed the comm to the Daedalus. Caldwell, he said. We're ready to come back through. Standing by, Caldwell said. Tell Jameson to prepare the research bay for a significant addition to the artifact catalog, Lasky said. We're bringing the installation home. He looked at the node at the installation's activated components, at the network architecture around them, at the gate that connected this place to every other place the network reached. He thought about Infinity sitting 3 days ago at the hub's coordinates, following a signal that had been designed to be followed, carrying a hull that had been designed to activate the hub, transporting an installation that had been designed to complete the connection, staffed by people who had been designed by 30 years of the worst the galaxy had offered, into exactly the kind of people who could be given everything the Vadranu had given them in the last 3 days, and could say yes clearly and with open eyes. Design was too strong a word. Prepared was closer. The Forerunners had prepared the installation. The Ancients had prepared the door. The galaxy had prepared the people. The rest had been Infinity arriving. He walked toward the gate. The return through the gate took 3 seconds. The 3 seconds between the Vadranu's network node and Infinity's secondary hangar bay, where the gate team had established the receiving point 43 hours ago when the mission began, contained, as gate transits always contained, the specific discontinuity of a consciousness moving through space without the experience of the movement. Jackson had been through enough gates that the discontinuity was familiar rather than disorienting. The body's brief objection to physics overridden by the accumulated evidence that it worked, and you arrived, and the arriving was indistinguishable from the departure, except for where you were standing. He stood in the hangar bay. He looked at the bay's familiar dimensions, Infinity's scale, the specific quality of human military engineering, the smell of recycled air and metal, and the ambient hum of 17,000 people going about the business of living and working on a ship that had been sitting at a network hub for 3 days while its mission parameters had been revised in several dimensions simultaneously. He felt the weight of everything he was carrying, not metaphorically the tablet with the translation record, the equipment case with the interface systems from the Vadranu's node, the 9 hours of exchange documentation that would become the foundation of the most significant revision to the SGC's understanding of the Milky Way since the program began. Physical weight in his hands. The metaphorical weight was also present, but he had learned a long time ago not to engage with the metaphorical weight until the physical weight was set down somewhere stable. Palmer came through behind him and immediately ran a visual assessment of the hangar bay with the professional reflex of a Spartan commander completing an extraction and confirming the receiving environment. Both fire teams through. Lasky, though. Anders through with the second equipment case. Secure, Palmer said, to no one specifically, and everyone present. The debriefing began 40 minutes later. Lasky ran it in the main briefing room. The full senior staff assembled. Caldwell present via secure.com from the Daedalus, alongside Landry's audio feed from the SGC. Jackson presented, and Anders supplemented on the technical elements, and the room received it with the specific quality of attention that significant information received when it was being processed by people who understood the significance. The Goa'uld's guided origin. The replicator precursor population. The 3 Ori remnant planets, the hidden network. Each element landed in the room with its own weight. The cumulative effect of the briefing producing in the assembled staff, the specific experience of having their model of the situation revised at every level. Simultaneously, the immediate tactical picture, the strategic landscape, the historical foundation beneath both. Jameson, who had been the bridge officer when the hub activated and had been managing the operational picture for 3 days with the competent steadiness of a lieutenant commander who had been in worse situations and had found them instructive, asked the question that the room had been building towards since the briefing began. The hidden network, he said. Double the size of the known network. 10,000-year-old ancient projects that need attention. He paused. What does attention mean? In practical terms, what does the SGC do with this? Jackson looked at him. In practical terms, he said, the SGC does what it's been doing for 30 years. It goes through gates. It assesses what it finds. It makes contact with the species it encounters and makes the decisions that those contacts require. He paused. The difference is the scale. And the Vadranu's intelligence picture, which means we go into the hidden network knowing what's there, rather than finding out the hard way. We've always found out the hard way, Jameson said. Yes, Jackson said. That's been a significant inefficiency. A sound in the room that was not quite a laugh but occupied the same register. Landry's voice on the comm had been present throughout the briefing, listening, occasionally asking the clarifying questions that his command position required, not interrupting the flow of the presentation with responses that the flow didn't need. When the briefing concluded, he spoke with the specific quality of a commanding general who had been receiving significant information for 3 days and had been building his response to it in parallel rather than sequentially. "The installation?" he said. "You're bringing it back to Earth." "The 43 components are aboard Infinity," Lasky said. "We'll need a permanent installation site somewhere the connection to the Vadranus architecture can be maintained without the interface systems being aboard a ship that moves." He paused. "The SGC is the obvious location. The SGC is going to need significant expansion to accommodate what the Vadranus intelligence picture is going to produce," Landry said. "In terms of operational capacity, mission planning, the personnel required to work the hidden network," he paused. "I'm going to be having a very long conversation with the Joint Chiefs." "And the IOA," Caldwell said. "And the IOA," Landry confirmed, in the tone of a man acknowledging an obligation he found less welcome than the Joint Chiefs conversation. "General," Jackson said. "Jackson, the Vadranus intelligence on the replicator precursor population," Jackson said. 18 months. That's the priority. Before the hidden network, before the expansion planning, before the IOA conversation. 18 months. "I know," Landry said. "We'll have a team en route to the precursor location within the week. The Vadranus coordinates are precise?" "Extremely precise," Jackson said. "Their monitoring of the precursor site goes back 7 years. The population distribution, the current replication rate, the optimal intervention point, it's all in the exchange documentation. I'll have the relevant sections translated and transmitted to the SGC by tomorrow morning." "Do it tonight," Landry said. "Yes, sir," Jackson said. The installation transfer from Infinity to the Daedalus took 6 hours. Not the physical transfer that was 2 hours. The 43 components carefully packed and transported through the intership corridor by Anders and her research team, each component logged and confirmed against the assembly inventory. The additional 4 hours were the interface configuration that Anders ran in the Daedalus's science bay, establishing the connection between the installation's communication system and the Daedalus's subspace architecture so that the Vadranus intelligence feed could be maintained during the transit from the hubs. Coordinates to Earth. The feed was continuous and quiet, not overwhelming. Not the 11-second everything mode of direct contact, but the specific background quality of a channel that was open and active and carrying information at the pace that the bridge vocabulary supported. Anders monitored it from the science bay. The monitoring required approximately 30% of her attention, which left 70% for the assembly documentation and the installation specifications that she was writing up for the SGC's permanent installation team. She had been awake for 41 hours at this point. She noted this and continued working. Lasky found Jackson in the forward observation lounge at 0200. The lounge was empty except for Jackson, who was at the viewport with his tablet and the specific quality of someone who had set down the physical weight and was now engaging with the metaphorical weight in the way that the metaphorical weight required not managing it, being present to it, letting the size of it be the size it was. Lasky sat in the chair beside him. He did not say anything immediately. This was something Lasky did. He had noticed it over 3 days. The specific patience of a commander who understood that some conversations began better with silence than with the first sentence. That the person who had been carrying something deserved the moment before the conversation required them to articulate it. Jackson looked at the stars visible through the viewport, the deep space of the hub's coordinates, the hub itself, visible in the middle distance, its gate no longer active now that the installation was complete, and the connection operated through the Vadranus' own network architecture rather than through the physical gate transit. "The hidden network," Jackson said. "The ancient projects, the civilizations they cultivated and abandoned." He paused. "I've spent 20 years studying what the ancients built and left. I have strong opinions about what they should have done differently." He paused again. This is going to be complicated. It usually is, Lasky said. No, Jackson said. I mean specifically complicated. The ancients cultivated civilizations the way people cultivate things, with intention and investment, and the specific relationship that develops between a cultivator and the thing being cultivated. And then they ascended and removed the addresses and left the things they cultivated to develop on their own for 10,000 years. He paused. Some of those civilizations are going to know about the ancients. Some are going to have mythologies and religions and foundational narratives built around them, and we're going to be the people who show up and say, "We're not the ancients, but we have their address book." Lasky was quiet for a moment. "That's not a military problem," he said. "No," Jackson said. "It's not. You're the person for it," Lasky said. "I'm one of the people for it," Jackson said. It's going to require a different kind of engagement than the SGC's standard first contact protocols, which were designed for civilizations that didn't know about the ancients and weren't shaped by the ancients. He paused. "We're going to need new protocols." "Write them," Lasky said. Jackson looked at him. "You have the translation record," Lasky said. "You have the Vadranu's documentation of what developed in the hidden network over 10,000 years. You have 20 years of experience with exactly the kind of complexity these contacts are going to produce." He paused. "Write the protocols. Give them to Landry. Make the case for the expanded operational structure they require." He paused. "This is what you're for." Jackson sat with this. He thought about 20 years of gates, about the things he'd found on the other sides of them, and the things those findings had required, and the specific way that the requiring had shaped him into someone who was ready, in the specific incremental sense of readiness, for what the next gate would require. "The ancients left the door," Jackson said, "because they thought someday someone might be ready." "Yes," Lasky said. "And the Forerunners built the installation because they believed the connection was worth making." "Yes," Lasky said. "And the Vadranus spent 10,000 years preparing everything they had to give to whoever arrived," Jackson said. "Yes," Lasky said. Jackson looked at the hub through the viewport at the structure that had activated 3 days ago when Infinity arrived with the key, at the gate that had connected them to the Vadranu's network, and the hidden network, and the galaxy you think you know. "We didn't ask for this," Jackson said. "No," Lasky said. "We didn't ask for this. We just showed up," Jackson said, "with the right hull and the right artifacts and the right translation work that had been sitting in a classified folder for 8 months. And the right instinct to say yes when yes was the answer," Lasky said. He paused. "The Vadranu said we have been patient in the 4-word message. That was the first thing they said." "Yes," Jackson said. 10,000 years of patient," Lasky said. "And the first thing they do when the door opens is say so. Not to brag. Not to establish the weight of the waiting. Just to name it. The patience is complete. The waiting is done." He paused. "I've been thinking about that phrasing for 3 days." "What have you been thinking about it?" Jackson said. "That patience is different from waiting," Lasky said. "Waiting is endurance. Patience is something that happens during endurance. The Vadranu didn't just wait 10,000 years. They did something with the 10,000 years. They built, they observed, they prepared." He paused. "The patience produced the preparation, and the preparation made the connection possible." He looked at the hub. "They were patient the way you're patient when you understand that the thing you're waiting for is going to matter, and therefore the waiting itself matters." Jackson thought about this. He thought about 8 months of translation work sitting in a classified folder because he hadn't had the context to know what to do with the implications. He thought about the research division's 3 years of artifact custody, 43 components of a Forerunner installation that nobody had recognized as an installation because nobody had had the Vadranu's correction to tell them what they were looking at. He thought about Infinity's slipspace drive following the hybrid signal for 6 weeks, and the approach taking 11 days, and the emergence into the hub's coordinates at 0600 ship time on the 73rd day. "We were being patient, too," Jackson said. "We just didn't know it." Lasky looked at him. "No," he said. "We just didn't know it." The Daedalus departed for Earth at 0600. The installation was secured in the science bay. The translation documentation was transmitted to the SGC in full. The Vadranu intelligence feed was active and stable. The background channel carrying the quiet, continuous information flow of a network intelligence that had been waiting 10,000 years to be connected and was now connected, and was using the connection with the specific, unhurried thoroughness of something that had always known the connection would be valuable and had prepared accordingly. Jackson was aboard the Daedalus. He had spent the 2 hours before departure transferring the relevant sections of the translation documentation to his working tablet, not the full record, which was too large for active use, but the sections that the next 6 months of work were going to require. The replicator precursor coordinates and population data, the 3 Ori remnant planet addresses, the hidden networks catalog, which ran to a document longer than anything he had previously produced in his career and which was going to require a team rather than an individual to process properly. He had already sent Landry a list of recommended personnel for the hidden network assessment team. Landry had approved it within 40 minutes, which was either a testament to Landry's trust in Jackson's judgment or evidence that Landry had been building the same list and Jackson's had arrived first. Probably both. Infinity remained at the hub. This was Lasky's call. Made in consultation with Caldwell and Landry, the ship would hold position for 72 hours while Anders and her research division completed the full documentation of the installation assembly and the exchange record and the Vadranu's intelligence architecture as it operated through the newly active connection. The documentation was the foundation of everything that came after. Foundations were worth taking the time to build correctly. Palmer used the 72 hours to run the operational assessment she had been deferring for 3 days. The comprehensive review of every tactical element of the mission, from the hub's activation to the team's extraction from the node. The after-action analysis that Palmer ran after every significant engagement, and that she ran with the same rigor regardless of whether the engagement had produced casualties or had produced the most significant development in human history. The review produced 17 recommendations. 3 of them were about Spartan positioning protocols for environments with non-physical threats. 4 were about equipment specifications for the interface systems, which had run warm, and in one case very warm, and which needed design revisions before they were deployed in a high-stakes engagement again. 7 were about the abort protocol, not that it had been wrong, but that it had been built for a specific threat profile that the Vadranu's actual behavior had not matched, and that the next mission of this type would need a different threat profile model to build from. The 17th recommendation was different from the others. It was 2 sentences. The mission parameters require a standing protocol for contact with pre-ancient intelligences that is separate from the SGC's standard first contact framework. Recommend, Dr. Jackson, be involved in the development of this protocol. Palmer had never before included a recommendation about a specific individual in an after-action review. She looked at the recommendation for a moment after she wrote it. She let it stand. Anders found the last thing at 1,800 on the 2nd day of the hold. She had been working through the installation documentation and cross-referencing it against the Vadranu intelligence feed when the feed produced something that was not in the exchange documentation, not something the Vadranu had said in the 9 hours of the primary communication, but something that had come through the connection in the 41 hours since the installation activated, carried in the background channel that she had been monitoring at 30% of her attention. She increased the attention allocation to 100%. The content was not intelligence, not history, not the offer or the exchange or any of the categories that the 9 hours had established. It was a question. In the bridge vocabulary that the 9 hours had developed, precise where the vocabulary was precise, approximate where it was approximate, clearly marked at every point where approximation replaced precision. The question was this. The installation was built by the Forerunners for the people who came after. You are the people who came after. We have been watching you develop for 10,000 years. We have a question that we have been considering for the duration of the watching. We ask it now because the connection exists, and the question requires the connection to be asked properly. The Forerunners built towards something at the end of their civilization. The ancients built towards something at the end of theirs. Both reached a point where the building stopped and the next form began ascension, the halo network, the specific transitions that mark the end of one phase and the beginning of the next. You are building towards something. We have been watching the building. We have a question about what you are building toward and whether you know. Anders read this 3 times. She looked at the interface system that had received it. She looked at the hub through the Science Bay viewport. She opened the comm to the bridge. Captain Lasky, she said. I need to show you something in the Science Bay. Lasky arrived in 4 minutes. He read the question. He read it again. He was quiet for a long time. What are we building toward? He said. Not to Anders to the question itself, to the 10,000-year-old intelligence that had been watching humanity develop since before the SGC existed and had decided that the connection was now established enough to ask. Anders looked at him. I don't know, she said. I've been thinking about it for 20 minutes and I don't know. Lasky looked at the interface system. He thought about the hub activating when Infinity arrived, about the Forerunners building the installation for the people who came after, about Jackson's translation and the Lantian researchers' passage and the patience that was different from waiting and the preparation that the patience had produced. He thought about Infinity, about the 3 kilometers of human engineering and Forerunner integration and 17,000 crew that had followed a signal for 6 weeks because a researcher in the artifact division had done her job correctly, and a captain had approved the course correction because the alternative was not knowing, and not knowing was not a position he was willing to stay in when knowing was available. He thought about what that was. What kind of civilization built that and sent it out? Get Jackson on the comm, he said. He's on the Daedalus, Anders said. In transit to Earth. I know where he is, Lasky said. Get him on the comm. The comm connected in 40 seconds. Jackson's voice had the quality of someone who had been asleep for 3 hours for the first time in 4 days and had been woken by a comm call and was awake anyway in the specific way that significant calls produced wakefulness. Before the mind had fully processed what the call was about. Lasky, Jackson said. The Vadaranu have a question, Lasky said. I'm sending it to your tablet. Read it and tell me what you think. A pause. The sound of a tablet being accessed. A longer pause. Oh, Jackson said. Yes, Lasky said. That's, Jackson stopped. That's the question. I know, Lasky said. What's the answer? Jackson was quiet for a moment that was longer than the processing pause and shorter than the sitting with pause, the specific duration of someone who had encountered a question that the 20 years had been building toward, was discovering that the 20 years had been preparation rather than detour. I'll need to think about it, Jackson said, properly, with the full translation record and the exchange documentation, and... I know, Lasky said. Think about it, properly. He paused. But before you do your instinct, right now, what are we building toward? Another pause. When Jackson spoke, his voice had the specific quality of someone saying something true before the analytical process had a chance to qualify it. Understanding, he said. That's what we've been building toward since the first gate address was dialed. Not power, not survival. Survival is a condition, not a direction. Understanding. The specific kind that comes from going through enough gates and meeting enough species and finding enough ruins and making enough translations that the picture of what the galaxy is and what consciousness is and what the relationship between them means starts to come into focus. He paused. We're not there. We're nowhere near there. But that's the direction. He paused again. And the Vadranu have been watching us go in that direction for 10,000 years, and they've decided the direction is real. Lasky looked at the interface system. He looked at the hub through the viewport. He thought about the question being a question rather than an assessment, the Vadranu asking rather than telling. After 10,000 years of watching, because the watching had produced an answer they had a hypothesis about, and they wanted to check the hypothesis against the source. "I'll send them the answer," Lasky said. "Send them my answer," Jackson said. "And tell them I have questions too. About what they've been watching. About what they've seen in 10,000 years of watching us build towards something we didn't know we were building toward." He paused. "That conversation is going to take a long time." "We have time," Lasky said. "Yes," Jackson said. "We do." The comm ended. Lasky looked at the interface system. He composed the response in the bridge vocabulary, imprecise in the places where imprecision was honest, and precise in the places where precision was available. Because the Vadranu valued accuracy over completion, and what he was transmitting needed to be accurate rather than complete. He transmitted it. The interface system carried it through the connection, through the installation's communication array, through the gate network subspace infrastructure, through the Vadranu's connectivity architecture, to wherever the question had originated, in the vast simultaneous network of an intelligence that was 10,000 years older than the gate network, and had spent those 10,000 years building and watching and waiting for the door to open. The response came back in the bridge vocabulary, 17 seconds later. Anders translated it. 4 words. The same 4 words as the beginning the message that had appeared on every screen aboard Infinity when the hub activated 3 days ago. The 4 words that had launched everything that followed. The message that the Vadranu had been composing and preserving for 10,000 years against the moment it would be sent. But different now. Not in content, the words were the same. In quality. In what the same words meant after 3 days of everything that had happened between the sending and the sending again. We have been patient. Not the patience of waiting. The patience of preparation. The patience of an intelligence that had spent 10,000 years building toward a connection and had built it correctly and was now, in the established connection, saying the thing it had always been going to say when the connection was established. We have been patient. The patience is complete. The connection is made. The building continues. Anders looked at the 4 words on the display. She looked at Lasky. He looked at the hub through the viewport, and then at the interface system, and then at the documentation spread across the science bay of the most significant 3 days in the UNSC's engagement with the broader galaxy, which was the most significant 3 days in the SGC's 30-year history, and was going to require longer than the longest briefing Jackson had ever given to fully account for. "Log it," Lasky said. "All of it. Beginning to end. Already logging," Anders said. "Good," he said. He stood in the science bay of a 3-kilometer warship that had followed a signal for 6 weeks, because a researcher had done her job, and a captain had approved the course, and a Forerunner-integrated hull had been the key. 10,000-year-old Locke had been waiting for, and looked at the 4 words on the display, and thought about what the galaxy you think you know became when you started finding out what it actually was. He thought it was a good problem to have. He thought they were ready for it. Not completely, not in the sense of having no uncertainty, in the sense of being capable of making the decision with open eyes and saying yes clearly, and building on the yes rather than waiting for a better yes that wasn't coming because the yes that was available was the right one. Outside, the hub sat in the deep space between star systems, its gate dark now, the connection running through the installation rather than through the physical transit. The door no longer needed, because the river had found the ocean, and the finding was done, and what remained was the living in the found. The living was the work. The work was the point.